She lost everything in one night. Her house, ashes, her son, a door slammed shut in her face. And at 65, she stands in the hallway of a dilapidated hotel, her hands trembling as she clutches an old phone, dialing a number she swore she would never dial again. But there are moments in life, not when you choose to survive, but when you are forced to. This is my story, and if you're watching this far, please stay, because it will change the way you see love, betrayal, and what truly deserves to be called home. Like, comment with the city you're watching from, so I know how far my story has come. And watch until the end, because this isn't the worst that's happened to me. Itzy, ashes, rejection, and the woman I had to become. Yuck. The first thing I smelled was smoke. Not the good kind. Not the kind that drifts from a neighbor's chimney on a cold October evening. The kind that makes you think of wool blankets and warm cider. This was the other kind. The kind that chews through wood and insulation and memory. The kind that doesn't ask permission. I woke up at 2:14 in the morning. I remember the exact time because the digital clock on my nightstand, the same one I'd owned since 1987, the one with the red numbers that flickered when the power dipped, was the last thing I saw clearly before everything turned orange. It took me 4 seconds to understand what was happening. 4 seconds to go from a woman sleeping in her own bed in her own home to a woman running barefoot across a floor that was already warm beneath her feet. I didn't grab much. My robe, my purse, by instinct more than thought, a reflex built from 65 years of never leaving a room without it, and the small suitcase I kept half packed under the bed, left over from a trip I'd been meaning to take for 3 years and never did. I made it out through the back door. I stood in my backyard in the dark in my nightgown, and I watched my house burn. 41 years. That's how long I had lived inside those walls. I moved in at 24, newly married, with 2 suitcases and a ceramic pot my mother had given me as a wedding gift. I raised my son in that house. I buried my husband from that house. I painted those walls 3 different colors over the decades, and every single version of them held something of me. My handprints in the plaster, my scuff marks on the hardwood floors, the pencil lines on the kitchen door frame where I'd measured my son's height every birthday until he turned 15 and told me he was too old for that. All of it gone. The firefighters came. They were kind, the way strangers are kind at funerals. Careful with their words, professional in their grief management, efficient about the thing they couldn't actually fix. The house was a loss. Electrical fault in the walls, they said, could have happened any time. I was lucky to get out. Lucky. I stood there wrapped in someone's emergency blanket, watching the roof cave in, and I thought, this is what lucky looks like. A neighbor? Myth. Patterson, who I'd exchanged exactly 9 words with over the past decade, offered me her couch for the night. I took it. I lay there in the dark, staring at her popcorn ceiling, and I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I called my son. His name is Daniel. He's 38 years old, and he lives 40 minutes away in a house that has 4 bedrooms and a guest suite, with its own bathroom and a kitchen island I once helped him pick out at a showroom in the city. I remember how proud he was when he bought that house. I remember standing in the driveway and watching him grin like he was 12 years old again. He answered on the 3rd ring, groggy and irritated. "Mom, it's almost 4 in the morning. Danny." My voice came out smaller than I intended. There was a fire, the house. What? Are you serious? It's gone, the whole thing. I got out, I'm okay, but I don't have anywhere to go. A pause, long enough that I pulled the phone away from my ear to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Okay," he said, "okay. Are you hurt?" "No, I'm at Mrs. Patterson's, but Danny, I can't stay here. She's being kind, but right, let me think. Let him think." As if this was a logistics problem. As if his mother calling from a stranger's couch at 4 in the morning, having just lost every physical thing she owned, was a scheduling conflict that needed to be sorted. "You can come here," he said finally. For tonight. For tonight. I should have caught it then. I should have heard the weight of those 2 words, felt the ceiling they were putting on his offer. But I was 65 years old and I had just watched my home burn down, and so I said thank you and I meant it. Daniel's wife is named Christine. She is 35, slim, composed in the way that very organized people are composed, like a room that's been decorated by someone who reads design magazines. She keeps her house immaculate. She speaks in a measured tone that never quite rises and never quite falls. She smiles at the right moments. She is, by every visible measure, a perfectly functional human being. She has never liked me. I knew this. I had always known this. I am not a stupid woman, whatever certain people in my life have occasionally implied. I knew from the first Christmas dinner where she corrected my pronunciation of something I'd been saying my whole life, from the first birthday where she told Daniel that his mother was a little much sometimes, a phrase she'd said quietly but not quietly enough, and which I had heard from the hallway and never mentioned. I knew. I simply chose for my son's sake to pretend otherwise. When I arrived at their house that morning, just after 6, wearing a neighbor's borrowed coat over my nightgown, dragging a half-packed suitcase on wheels across their pristine front walkway, Christine was already up. She was standing in the kitchen in a silk robe, making pour-over coffee, her dark hair already somehow perfect. She looked at me the way you look at a stain on a white tablecloth. "Evelyn," her tone was careful. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "I'm sorry to arrive so early. Don't apologize." She said it quickly, the kind of quick that's about cutting something off before it goes further. Daniel told me what happened. It's terrible. Truly, truly. The word sitting there like a prop. She poured me coffee. She showed me to the guest room. Yes, the one with its own bathroom, the one I'd helped them choose the towel colors for. She was gracious. She was composed. And somewhere in the precise geometry of her graciousness, I felt the walls already going up. I slept for 6 hours. When I woke up, it was almost noon, and I could hear them in the kitchen. I should have made more noise coming down the hallway. I should have announced myself. That's what a smart woman does. That's what a woman who spent her whole life trying not to cause problems does. She clears her throat, she shuffles her feet, she gives people time to change the subject. I didn't. It can't be permanent, Daniel. Christine's voice low and even. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because we have a life here. She's my mother. She just lost her house. I understand that, I do. But you know how she is. She'll get comfortable and then it becomes... What? What does it become? Our problem. Silence. I stood very still in the hallway, my hand against the wall, my coffee going cold in my hand. Our problem. 41 years of Christmases, of sending birthday cards, of biting my tongue at dinner tables, of driving 40 minutes to watch my grandson's soccer games in the rain, standing on the sideline in my good coat while Christine chatted with the other mothers and Daniel checked his phone. All of that compressed into 2 words. Our problem. She has insurance, Christine said. The claim takes time, Christine. We're talking weeks, maybe months. Then she should look at short-term options. Extended stay hotels, assisted living. She's 65. She doesn't need assisted living. I'm just saying there are resources. She's my mother. Another silence. Longer this time. Daniel. Christine's voice dropped even lower, took on that particular softness that isn't soft at all, that's just quieter pressure. I need you to think about what you're committing to here. Before you make promises you can't keep. I need you to think about us. I went back to the guest room. I sat on the edge of the bed, the very comfortable, very clean, very neutral colored bed in the guest room of the house where I was apparently already a problem. And I sat there for a long time, very still. I've lived 65 years on this earth. I've buried a husband. I've raised a child alone for most of it, because Daniel's father was not a bad man, but he was a present absence, there in body and somewhere else in spirit. I've worked and scrimped and kept a home together through 4 recessions and 1 pandemic, and a leaking roof. I fixed myself because I couldn't afford the plumber. I know how to survive. What I didn't know was that surviving sometimes looks like sitting on someone else's bed in someone else's house, listening to them decide whether you're worth the inconvenience. Daniel came to the room at 3 in the afternoon. He knocked, which I appreciated. He knocked like a man who knows he's done something wrong before he's even done it yet, which is somehow worse than a man who doesn't know. "Hey, Mom." "Hey, Danny." He sat in the chair by the window. He's a good-looking man, my son. He has his father's jaw and my eyes. He looked tired in the way that people who've been having difficult conversations look tired. Not from lack of sleep, but from the effort of maintaining a position under pressure. "How are you feeling?" "I've been better," I said. I kept my voice even. I'd had 3 hours to prepare for this conversation, and I was not going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. "Right, yeah." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Listen, Mom, I've been thinking about next steps for you. Your insurance should kick in pretty quickly, and I was looking at some extended stay options nearby. Some of them are actually really nice. Danny, and I can help you with the first month financially if Daniel." My voice came out sharper than I intended. He stopped. "Look at me." He looked at me. "I heard you and Christine this morning." He had the decency to go pale. "And Mom, I'm not angry. And the thing was, I meant it, or I thought I did. I'm not asking you to choose. I'm not going to make this into a scene. I just need you to be honest with me right now, without the buffer, without the extended stay brochures. Are you asking me to leave?" The pause before he answered was 3 seconds long. I counted. "We're not equipped," he said finally, "to have a long-term house guest situation right now. I know the timing is, I know it's terrible, Mom, and I'm sorry, I really am. But Christine and I have a rhythm, and Emma and Tyler are in school, and I understand," I said. "I would pay for—" "I understand, Daniel." He looked relieved. That was the part that cracked something in me, not when he said it, but when I saw the relief move across his face. The fact that my understanding made him feel better, the fact that my erasure was a weight he was glad to be free of. "I'll pack up tonight," I said. "I'll find something in the morning." "Mom, you don't have to leave tonight." "I'll pack tonight." I smiled at him. A real smile, I think, or something close to it. "You've been a good son, Danny. You really have." I don't know why I said that. Maybe because I believed it. Maybe because I needed to say something true before I left. He didn't argue. He hugged me at the door, a real hug, the kind that means something even when everything else doesn't. And I held on to him a little longer than I should have, like I was memorizing the shape of it. Then I picked up my suitcase and I walked out. I drove to the first motel I found with a vacancy sign lit up, the Sycamore Inn, off Route 9. 27 rooms, a vending machine that ate my dollar bill, and a carpet the color of regret. I paid for 3 nights with my credit card, which had a limit I was already calculating against. Room 14, a queen bed, a bathroom with a shower head that leaned slightly left, a window overlooking a parking lot. I set my suitcase on the luggage rack, and I stood in the middle of the room and I thought, what now? This is the question that every crisis eventually delivers you to. Not why and not how could this happen. Those questions are luxuries, questions for people with time and stability and someone to talk to over dinner. The question that a parking lot motel at 9 o'clock at night delivers you to is simpler and more brutal. What now? I sat down on the bed. I opened my purse because that's what you do when you're terrified. You take stock. Wallet, lip balm, reading glasses, 3 receipts, the small notebook I carry everywhere, my phone with its cracked screen, which had held this crack since October, and which I'd been meaning to replace and now probably wouldn't for some time. I had in my savings account approximately $11,000, which sounds like something until you account for the fact that I was 65 years old with no property and no immediate income, that my insurance claim would take weeks to process and the payout when it came would depend on assessments and adjusters and fine print I'd never thought to read carefully, and that $11,000 is about 8 months of doing nothing drastic. I had, in my life, a son who loved me enough to pay for the first month of a hotel room, but not enough to give me the room he'd built for exactly this kind of emergency. I had, in my heart, a particular kind of exhaustion that isn't tiredness. It's the exhaustion that comes from spending decades being carefully reasonable, from not making scenes, from understanding, from accommodating, from making yourself smaller and smaller until you fit into whatever space other people are willing to allocate for you. I was done being that size, but I also didn't know yet what size I was instead. I didn't sleep that first night. I lay in the dark of room 14 and I listened to the sound of Route 9 outside. The occasional truck, the distant traffic lights cycling green to red to green, and I let my mind go somewhere it hadn't been in a long time. Backward, not to the fire, not to Daniel's kitchen or Christine's careful voice, further back, to a September afternoon in 1983, when I was 23 years old and working at a law firm as a legal secretary, and I met a man named Adrian Hale. He was a client, not mine, not my responsibility. He'd come in for something routine, some property matter, and he was waiting in the reception area when I walked through with a stack of files and knocked half of them off the edge of the desk, papers scattering across the floor like a small indoor weather event. He was the only person in the waiting room who got up to help me pick them up. We talked for 7 minutes while I reordered the files. I know it was 7 minutes because I'd glanced at the clock twice, and I remember thinking each time that I should stop talking and get back to work. I didn't stop talking. He asked me to dinner 3 days later, a note left at the reception desk, because he was the kind of man who did things that way, deliberate and slightly formal, with a courtesy that wasn't performance, just how he was made. We went to dinner, then another dinner, then a Sunday morning walk along the waterfront that turned into a whole day neither of us had planned. For 14 months, Adrian Hale was the most important person in my life. And then Martin Carter happened. Martin was easier to love than Adrian in the way that certain things are easier than others. Not because they're better, but because they require less of you. Martin was warm and funny and present in a way that didn't ask me to be brave. Adrian loved me in a way that was demanding in its depth. Being with Adrian meant being fully seen, and at 24, fully seen was terrifying. Martin proposed on a Tuesday. Adrian had never proposed. We had talked about the future in the way that two people who are serious about each other talk about it, carefully and with hope, but he hadn't asked the question yet, and Martin asked it, and I said yes. I wrote Adrian a letter. He didn't call. I told myself it was because he understood, which was easier than the truth, which was that some wounds don't come with a response. I hadn't spoken to him in 41 years. Lying in room 14 of the Sycamore Inn, I thought about that letter. I thought about the fact that I'd made my choice and lived inside it with full commitment. I had been a good wife, I had been a good mother, I had built something real and honest from the life I'd chosen. I had no regrets about the substance of it. But at 2 a.m. in a motel room, freshly stripped of everything, you are allowed to wonder about the road you didn't take. Not to wish you'd taken them, just to wonder. I opened the small notebook from my purse. I flip through it sometimes when I can't sleep. I've kept notebooks since I was 20, filled with phone numbers and grocery lists and random thoughts and quotes I wanted to remember. This one was 2 years old. Near the back, in handwriting I didn't immediately recognize as my own, because I'd written it during a long, strange afternoon 3 years ago when I'd had a glass of wine and gotten caught in a research spiral I still can't fully explain. Near the back of the notebook, there was a phone number and a name, Adrian Hale. I'd looked him up 3 years ago, some idle Sunday afternoon impulse I hadn't acted on. Written the number down and then turned the page and never looked at it again. I stared at it now. The thing about being at the bottom, true bottom, not the manageable inconveniences we usually call the bottom, is that it rearranges your sense of what's possible. When you have nothing, the risk calculation changes. What's the worst that happens? He doesn't answer, or he answers and doesn't know who I am, or he knows who I am and doesn't care. All of those outcomes leave me exactly where I already am, sitting in room 14, alone. I picked up my phone with the cracked screen. My hand was shaking. I want to be honest about that. I am not a woman who shakes easily, and my hand was shaking. I dialed the number. It rang 4 times. I was already composing the voicemail I would leave. Brief, not desperate, something dignified. When someone picked up. Hello? A man's voice. Older, obviously, but there's something about a voice that doesn't fully age, some frequency that stays the same, and I knew it immediately. The same way you know a song from the first 3 notes. I forgot every word I'd planned to say. Adrian. His name came out of me like it had been waiting behind my teeth for 40 years. It's Evelyn Carter. A pause, a very long, very breathless pause. And then quiet and absolute and nothing like what I'd expected. Evelyn, I know who you are. I don't remember exactly how long we talked. An hour, maybe more. I told him about the fire. I told him about Daniel. I didn't tell him everything. Some things you don't say in a first conversation after 4 decades of silence. Some things need to be earned. But I told him enough. I told him I was in a motel on Route 9 with a broken shower head and 3 days paid. And he said, give me your room number. I'll be there in the morning. Adrian. Room number, Evelyn. I gave it to him. I hung up the phone and sat there in the dark room and pressed my palms flat against my thighs to stop them from shaking. Outside on Route 9, a truck went by. The traffic light cycled from red to green. I lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of my own breathing. And for the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what might still be coming. I slept eventually. Not well. I never sleep well in strange rooms, and this was a stranger room than most, but I slept. And I dreamed about that September afternoon in 1983, the scattered papers, the 7 minutes, the man who got up from his chair when everyone else stayed seated. Some things, I think, have a way of finding you when you finally stopped running from them. I don't know if that's hope or just the particular cruelty of memory. I suppose I was about to find out. In room 14 of the Sycamore Inn, with $40 left in my wallet and a phone call I couldn't take back, I lay awake until the grey light began to push through the curtains. And I told myself what I'd been telling myself my whole life, the thing that had gotten me through every impossible morning, 1 hour at a time. Just 1 hour. You can do anything for 1 hour. But I want to tell you something I've never said out loud before. That night, for the first time in a very long time, maybe the first time since I was 23 years old and reading a note left at a reception desk, I wasn't just surviving the hour, I was waiting for something. And that small, fragile, terrifying difference is the thing that changed everything. I woke up at 6:47 in the morning to the sound of a door slamming somewhere down the hall, and for exactly 3 seconds I forgot where I was. 3 seconds of thinking I was home. 3 seconds of reaching for the familiar weight of my own blanket, the particular creak of my own mattress, the grey morning light coming through windows I'd covered with the same curtains for 20 years. Then the smell hit me. That particular motel smell, industrial detergent and recycled air, and the faint ghost of 1,000 strangers. And I remembered everything. The fire, the clock showing 2:14, the backyard, Daniel's kitchen, Christine's voice drifting down the hall, room 14 of the Sycamore Inn. The phone call I'd made at 2 in the morning to a man I hadn't spoken to in 4 decades. I sat up slowly the way you do when your body's older than your sense of urgency. My first coherent thought was, what have I done? My second was, he said he'd come. These 2 thoughts existed simultaneously, pulling in opposite directions, and I sat between them on the edge of a motel bed and tried to decide which one was the more honest response to the situation I'd created for myself. I went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror for longer than I usually do. I've never been a vain woman, Martin used to say that about me, and he meant it as a compliment, though I occasionally wondered if he was also saying something else. But I'm human, and I'm a woman who had just invited someone from her distant past to come and see her in a motel room after a house fire. So yes, I looked in the mirror. 65 years old. Silver hair I'd stopped fighting somewhere around 62. Lines around my eyes that I've earned. A face that has held grief and ordinary happiness and a great deal of careful composure, sometimes all at once. I didn't look like the 23-year-old woman Adrian had known, obviously. But I also didn't look the way I sometimes felt when Daniel's voice went careful around me, like I was something fragile that needed to be managed. I looked like what I was, a woman who'd survived the night. That would have to be enough. I showered, changed into the cleanest clothes from my half-packed suitcase, black slacks, a navy blouse I'd thrown in without thinking and was now quietly grateful for. And I sat in the chair by the window to wait. The parking lot of the Sycamore Inn in the early morning was not a romantic setting. A pickup truck with a cracked windshield, a minivan with a rental company sticker, a tabby cat picking its way across the asphalt with an air of profound indifference to human suffering. The coffee from the lobby machine tasted like it had been brewed sometime during a previous administration. I drank 2 cups anyway. He'd said morning. I didn't know what morning meant to him now. I knew what it had meant to him at 30. He'd been an early riser, one of those people who greet the day without resentment, who I'd found both admirable and slightly incomprehensible. But 40 years rearrange a person's rhythms like everything else. I sat with my coffee and my cracked phone, and my window view of a tabby cat who did not care about any of this. And I waited. At 8:23, a dark blue car pulled into the lot. It parked. The engine went quiet, and then nothing happened for about 45 seconds, which told me something. That he was sitting in that car the way I'd been sitting in this chair, taking a breath, composing himself, deciding how to walk into a moment that couldn't be undone. The door opened. I watched him get out of the car. He was 70, or close to it. I'd done the arithmetic after I'd hung up the phone. He'd been 7 years older than me when we met, which made him 67, maybe 68. He was taller than I'd remembered, or maybe just held himself differently, with the particular uprightness of a man who has maintained something essential about himself over time. His hair had gone fully white, and he wore it shorter than he used to. He was heavier through the shoulders. He moved more carefully than I remembered, not slowly but deliberately, like a man who has learned that rushing things doesn't actually get you there faster. He stood in the parking lot and looked up at the building, finding the room numbers, finding mine. I stepped back from the window, which was absurd. He couldn't see me. The light was wrong. I was behind the glass. But I stepped back anyway, because watching him look for me felt like something I wasn't ready to witness directly. Some tenderness I needed a few more seconds to prepare for. Then I took a breath, put down my terrible coffee, and opened the door before he could knock. We stood there looking at each other across the threshold of room 14. 41 years of silence compressed into about 10 seconds. He looked at me the way I'm going to try to say this without turning it into something it wasn't. The way that people look at things they thought they'd lost. Not with possession, not with hunger, with something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. Recognition maybe, but of something deeper than just the face. Evelyn, he said. Adrian, one word each, as if we'd agreed in advance that we'd start there. You look... He stopped. Don't, I said. I know what I look like. I was going to say like yourself. The corner of his mouth moved, but I understand why you'd be suspicious of compliments right now. Something in my chest released slightly, not all the way, but slightly. Come in, I said. It's not much. I've seen worse. He stepped inside, and I noticed him notice the room. The listing luggage rack, the vending machine light blinking through the window, the cup of bad coffee on the nightstand, and he noticed it without judgment, just the clean acknowledgement of what was actually there. Are you all right? Actually all right, not the version of all right you tell people. I sat down on the edge of the bed because my knees, with impeccable timing, chose that moment to feel their age. I don't know yet. Last night I thought I was. This morning I'm less certain. He pulled the chair from the small desk and sat down across from me. And it was strange, the strangest thing about the whole strange morning, how ordinary that felt. Not comfortable exactly, but familiar in some way that bypassed all the years in between. Like a chord you haven't played in decades, but your fingers still know. Tell me what happened, he said, all of it from the beginning. So I did. I told him about the fire, the way you tell a story when you've had a few hours to start digesting it. Not hysterically, not calmly, but somewhere between the two, which is the honest register of real shock. I told him about Mrs. Patterson's couch. I told him about Daniel, and I told him about Christine, and I told him about hearing those words through the kitchen doorway. Our problem. He listened the way some people listen. Not just waiting for his turn to speak, but actually in it with me, his expression shifting with the story, eyes steady on mine. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer premature comfort. He just let me talk until I'd emptied it out, the whole weight of the past 18 hours. And when I stopped, he didn't immediately fill the silence. That was, I would realize later, one of the things I'd forgotten about him. His patience, not passive patience, not the patience of someone who doesn't care enough to react, but active patience, the kind that takes effort, the kind that says, I am here and I am not going anywhere, and I will wait as long as it takes for you to get to the real thing. After a moment, he said, your son told you there was no room for you. He told me they weren't equipped for a long-term house guest situation. In a house with 4 bedrooms, and a guest suite with its own bathroom. I heard how that sounded. I'm not saying I wanted to live there forever. I understand they have a life. I understand that marriages require... I stopped. I understand all the reasonable things. I just didn't expect another stop. What? He said. What didn't you expect? I looked at the window. The tabby cat was gone. I didn't expect to feel like an inconvenience to my own son. The room was quiet for a beat. Evelyn. His voice was careful with my name. You're not an inconvenience. You are a woman whose house burned down and who needed her son and he failed her. Those are different things. I looked at him. Don't let him make you the problem, Adrian said. Whatever story gets told about this, don't accept the version where you were asking for too much. I hadn't cried yet, not through the fire, not through Mrs. Patterson's couch, not through Daniel's kitchen, not through the night, alone in this room. I'd been holding myself with both hands, staying functional, doing what needed doing, being practical about the impractical situation I was in. The backs of my eyes went hot. I didn't cry, but it was close. I don't know what to do next, I said. That's the honest answer. I have some money. I have an insurance claim in process. I have a suitcase and a phone with a cracked screen and absolutely no plan. Okay, he said. Okay, I have a plan. He said it simply, without the performance of someone announcing something dramatic, just a statement. Come and stay with me. I have more space than one person needs, and I live alone, and you won't be an inconvenience. You'll be a guest. There's a difference. I stared at him. Adrian, we haven't spoken in 41 years. I know. I gestured at the space between us, trying to indicate the obvious absurdity of what he was suggesting. We're not the same people. No, he agreed. We're not. I'm not asking you to pretend we are. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees, and I noticed his hands. Older hands, with the kind of worn quality that comes from real work, which surprised me, though I wasn't sure why. I'm asking you to let someone help you, that's all. The rest of it, whatever we are to each other now, what this means, what it doesn't mean, we figure that out later. First, you need to not be sitting in a $20 motel room with bad coffee and nowhere to go. Am I wrong? I looked at the cup of bad coffee. It was $38 a night, I said, even worse. Something cracked open in my chest that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite tears and was honestly both. You don't know me anymore, Adrian. Not really. No, he said, but I'd like to. The honest, simple directness of it. No performance, no strategy. Just the fact of the thing, offered plainly. This was what I'd forgotten too. The way he spoke, without the layer of management that most people put between themselves and what they actually mean. I sat there in room 14 of the Sycamore Inn with my bad coffee and my half-packed suitcase, and I thought about Christine's silk robe and her pour-over coffee and the word inconvenience hanging in her kitchen like smoke. I need to pay for the 3 nights, I said finally. What? I paid for 3 nights. I'm only using 1. I need to see if they'll refund the difference. He looked at me for a moment and then he said, okay, let's go to the front desk. We went to the front desk. They refunded 2 nights. It wasn't a large victory, but it was mine, and I held it like one. We checked me out of room 14 at 9:15 in the morning. I put my suitcase in the trunk of his car, and I got in the passenger seat. And as he pulled out of the Sycamore Inn parking lot and onto Route 9, I looked back at the motel through the side mirror, and I thought, I made it through the night. Whatever comes next, I made it through the night. That was something. That was enough for now. We drove for about 20 minutes, mostly in silence, which wasn't uncomfortable. Another thing I'd forgotten, how the silence between us had never been the anxious kind. He had the radio on low, something instrumental and quiet. The morning was clear, the kind of October clear that is beautiful in a way that seems almost thoughtless, all bright light and bare trees and sky the color of cold water. Tell me something, I said, when we'd been on the highway long enough that the silence had settled into something companionable. What did you do after, with your life? He glanced at me, then back at the road. Architecture. I told you I was thinking about it back then. Took the leap about a year after. One paused. After we stopped talking, went back to school, built a small firm, did that for 30 years. Are you still working? Slowed down. I still consult. But I sold the firm 4 years ago. He said it without the particular pride that men sometimes attach to professional achievements, just as information. I was married for a while, Ellen. She passed 7 years ago. I'm sorry. It was a long illness. We had time to say what needed saying. He was quiet for a moment. No children. We tried. It didn't happen. Another pause. What about Martin? Heart attack, I said. 12 years ago. Very sudden. I heard. He stopped. I turned to look at him. You heard? He kept his eyes on the road, but something in his profile shifted, the particular quality of a man deciding whether to say the true thing. I kept track from a distance over the years. I wasn't watching you, nothing like that, but I knew some things. I should have found that strange. Maybe I did, a little. But mostly what I felt, sitting in the passenger seat in the October morning, was something I couldn't quite name. Not warmth exactly, but a warmth-adjacent thing. The knowledge that someone had held a space for me, even at a distance, even in silence, even when I wasn't looking. He was a good man, I said about Martin. Not perfect, neither was I. But we were honest with each other. I'd rather have that than the alternative. So would I, Adrian said, and left it there. His house was not what I expected, though I couldn't have told you what I expected. Something large and imposing, maybe, with the particular grandness that successful men sometimes use to announce themselves. Instead, it was a low, wide structure set back from the road behind mature trees, the kind of house that reveals itself slowly, a roof line first, then the windows, then the breadth of it, which was considerable but not showy. Designed, I realized, the way only an architect designs his own home, not for impact, but for how it feels to live inside it. You built this, I said, not a question. 15 years ago, he pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. It took me 10 years after I had the idea, before I felt ready to actually build it. What were you waiting for? He was quiet for a moment before answering. I kept thinking there should be someone to share it with. It took me a long time to accept that waiting for that wasn't the same as earning it. I held that sentence in my mouth for a moment before setting it aside. Some things you need to let sit before you can take them apart properly. He showed me around the house with the ease of a man who has learned not to perform his own life for visitors. The kitchen was large and real looking, not staged, with actual cooking evidence of it, a pot soaking in the sink, a coffee maker that looked used and well loved. The living room faced a wide yard, oak trees at the back edge of the property, a patio with furniture that was expensive but not precious, meant for actual sitting. There were books everywhere, not decoration books arranged for aesthetics, real books with cracked spines and bookmarks and post-it notes bristling from the pages. The guest room was at the end of a short hall. It was simple and clean, with its own bathroom, which under different circumstances would have reminded me of something I didn't want to think about, but which I decided consciously not to let it. "This is yours," he said, "for as long as you need it. No conditions. Adrian, Evelyn." He said my name with quiet emphasis, not sharp, just firm. "Please don't argue about this right now. You've been through enough in the last 24 hours. Just put your suitcase down." I put my suitcase down. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and looked at the window. Real curtains, actual fabric, not the institutional beige of the motel. And I exhaled something that had been sitting in my chest since 2:14 in the morning. "Thank you," I said. My voice was unsteady in a way I hadn't planned. "Don't thank me yet," he said from the doorway. "I cook dinner at 7, and I don't apologize for it if it's not perfect." What does that mean? It means I'm a competent cook who occasionally overcooks chicken. He said it matter-of-factly. Fair warning. I looked at him. This man who had driven 40 minutes at 9 in the morning to collect a woman he hadn't seen in 4 decades from a motel parking lot. This man who had kept track from a distance. Who said you're not an inconvenience like it was the most obvious fact in the world. "Adrian," I said, "why did you come? Really?" The question landed between us with a certain weight. He didn't answer immediately. He leaned against the doorframe, and I watched him think about it. Not performing the thinking, actually doing it, in that way he had of treating questions like they deserve real engagement. "Because you called," he said, "and that meant something. After 41 years you called, that's not nothing. Maybe I just had no other options." "Maybe," he said. "That doesn't change what it meant." He straightened up from the doorframe. "Rest. I'll be in the kitchen." He left me alone with my suitcase and the curtains and the particular quiet of a house that was not a motel, not a son's guest room with invisible terms and conditions, not anyone's spare category. I unpacked my suitcase slowly. I put my few things in the dresser drawers. I hung the 2 nicer blouses in the closet. I set my reading glasses and my notebook on the nightstand, which felt presumptuous and also necessary, because some claim of space, however small, is what keeps a person a person. I sat back down on the bed and I picked up my phone. I had 3 missed texts from Daniel, sent over the course of the morning. The first one, "How are you doing? Where did you end up?" The second 2 hours later, "Mom, let me know you're okay." The third sent about an hour after that. I looked into the extended stay option on Maple Avenue. They have openings. I can help with the deposit. I read all 3. I set the phone down. Here is what I wanted to do. I wanted to feel loved by those texts. I wanted to read them as evidence that my son cared, that he was thinking of me, that the conversation I'd overheard in his kitchen had been anxiety and not truth, an ugly moment and not the real shape of how he felt about me. Here is what I actually felt, the particular sourness of watching someone manage guilt in real time, the extended stay on Maple Avenue, the deposit help. Not "come back, Mom, I was wrong," not "I talked to Christine and she understands," just logistics, resources, the infrastructure of caring without the actual presence of it. I am not an easy woman to dismiss. I want to be honest about that. I have spent my life being easy to dismiss, making myself quiet, making myself accommodating, making myself the version of a person that causes the least disruption. But that's behavior, not nature. My nature is something else, something that doesn't lie down. I had spent 41 years choosing quiet accommodation. I'd done it in my marriage, in friendships, with Christine. With the slow, barely visible way Daniel's priorities had rearranged themselves after he married her. I'd done it so automatically that I'd mostly stopped noticing. But sitting in Adrian's guest room with my books on the nightstand and my 2 blouses in the closet and the smell of actual wood and old paper, instead of industrial detergent, something in me was beginning to notice again. Something that had been very small and very quiet for a very long time. I texted Daniel back. I kept it brief. I found a place to stay with a friend. I'm fine. I'll be in touch about the insurance process. Thank you for checking on me. I reread it once before sending. It was the most carefully calibrated message I'd ever sent him. Every word chosen. Not cold. I was his mother and I loved him. And that wasn't the kind of thing that switches off because someone disappoints you, but not the usual either. Not the version that made myself smaller to keep the peace. He replied 20 minutes later, "Oh good, who's the friend? Do I know them?" I put the phone face down on the nightstand. At noon, Adrian knocked on the door and told me he'd made soup and asked if I wanted to eat. I said yes. I came to the kitchen table and we ate tomato soup from scratch. He'd made it from actual tomatoes, I could tell. And crusty bread he'd bought that morning, and we talked. Not about the important things, not yet. We talked the way people who have been through something large together talk when they need a rest from the largeness of it, about small things. He told me about a project he'd consulted on recently, a community center in the next county, and the particular satisfaction of designing space for people who actually needed it, rather than people who wanted to impress each other with their taste. I told him about the garden I'd had at the house, the roses I'd been growing for 15 years, the tomatoes that never came out right, no matter what I did. I had a hydrangea, I said, blue, by the back fence. My neighbors always wanted a cutting from it. The past tense sat there between us. I'm sorry, he said. The garden was the second thing I thought of, I said. After the house itself, I stood in the backyard watching it burn, and I thought, the photo albums are gone. And then I thought the hydrangea. What was the third thing? I looked at him across the soup. My pencil marks on the kitchen door frame. I used to measure Daniel every year. The marks are gone. His expression shifted into something I didn't have immediate language for. Older grief, maybe, the kind that understands. The marks were in you before they were in the wood, he said. I wanted to dismiss that as too simple. I held it instead. We washed the dishes together, side by side, at his kitchen sink, which was a strangely ordinary thing to do with a man I'd last seen in 1983, but which felt somehow like exactly the right temperature for the strange new situation. Neither too intimate nor too formal, just 2 people cleaning up after lunch. That afternoon, I called my insurance company. 45 minutes on hold, then 25 minutes talking to an adjuster who was professionally sympathetic in the way that people paid to be sympathetic are professionally sympathetic. Claims process initiated. Assessment scheduled for the following week. Preliminary estimate would take 3 to 4 weeks after that. I wrote everything down in my notebook in my careful handwriting. I called the bank and inquired about my actual savings balance, which turned out to be slightly more than I'd remembered, 11,400 and some change, because I'd apparently deposited a check 3 weeks ago and forgotten about it. I noted that down too. When I came out of the guest room, Adrian was in the living room reading, and he looked up when I appeared and said simply, "How did that go?" And I told him, and he listened, and he said, "That's manageable." And the simple confidence of it, not false confidence, just the grounded kind, was more useful to me in that moment than any amount of sympathy. "I'm going to need to find somewhere permanent," I said. "I want you to know I'm not treating this as I'm not planning to impose indefinitely." "You're not imposing," he said, "and you can't look for something permanent in a week. So stop apologizing for time you haven't even used yet." I sat down in the chair across from him. He set down his book. The October afternoon light came through the wide windows and laid itself across the floor between us, and for a moment neither of us said anything, and it was not awkward. It was simply two people existing in the same room without needing to fill it. "I want to ask you something," I said. "Okay." "When you said you'd kept track over the years," I watched his face. Were you ever angry about how things ended?" He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Not angry, no." Another pause. I was hurt for a long time. Then I had a life. Ellen, the firm, work I cared about, the hurt receded. He looked at me steadily, but it never fully went away. "I think that's honest." "I'm sorry," I said, "for the way I ended it. The letter it was cowardly." "You were 24, he said, "and scared. You didn't owe me bravery." "I owed you better than a letter." "Maybe." He picked up his book, then set it back down. "It was 41 years ago, Evelyn. I don't carry it as a wound anymore. I carry it as—" He stopped, seemed to search for the right word. "History. Mine and yours both." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had answered the phone at 2 a.m, who had driven 40 minutes and asked no conditions, who cooked from scratch and kept his books cracked-spined and designed community centers for people who needed them. There was a lot I didn't know about him yet. 41 years of not knowing, which is a considerable amount. And I was 65 years old and displaced and in the middle of an insurance claim and nowhere close to a position where new beginning was anything other than a dangerous thought. But there was also this. I was at a table in someone's home, not as an inconvenience, not as a managed obligation, not as a problem that needed to be solved at arm's length. I was here because someone had chosen to come for me. That was not a small thing. At dinner that evening, chicken which he did slightly overcook as warned, we talked for almost 2 hours, not about the past and not about the logistics and not about what any of this meant. We talked about books and architecture and what I'd done with 20 years of library volunteering, which I'd started shortly after Martin died and which had given me back something I hadn't known I'd been missing. We talked about his sister who lived in Florida and his 2 nieces and the community center project and a piece of music he'd been trying to understand for the past year that kept defeating him. At some point I realized the sun had been down for a while and the kitchen lamp had taken over, and I'd eaten all of my slightly overcooked chicken, and my shoulders were somewhere near where they were supposed to be, rather than hunched up around my ears. "I should let you have your evening," I said. "You are my evening," he said. "This is it. I'm not hiding a social calendar." I laughed. An actual laugh, which surprised me. He smiled, and I saw in it, clearly, unavoidably, what had been there 41 years ago, the particular quality of his attention, the way he looked at me like I was the actual thing and not a version of it, like there was no management happening, no calculation about what to give and what to withhold. Just me as I was, received as such. It was terrifying, and it was also the least terrified I'd felt in 2 days. I washed the dishes, he dried them. We said goodnight in the hallway with the particular careful courtesy of 2 people who don't quite have language yet for what they are to each other. And I went to the guest room and sat on the bed in the dark for a while before turning on the light. My phone had 2 more texts from Daniel. I read them and put the phone back down. My notebook was on the nightstand. I opened it to a blank page and I wrote, in the careful handwriting I've had my whole life, 3 things. Insurance, assessment next week. Savings, 11,400. The hydrangea is gone. Then I sat there looking at what I'd written. The hydrangea was gone. The pencil marks were gone. The house was 41 years of my life, compressed into ash and structural loss assessments, and a claim number that an adjuster would process in 3 to 4 weeks. And yet, I was sitting in a room that wasn't a motel. I'd eaten dinner with someone who talked to me like I was worth talking to. I'd laughed at something. I don't have a word for what I felt in that moment. Not hope. Hope felt too light, too forward-looking for a woman who was still very much inside the disaster. Not gratitude exactly, though I felt that too. Something older than both of those things. Something like, I am still here, not despite the fire, through it, beyond it, still standing on the other side. That was what I wrote last, before I turned off the light. Still here. I meant it as a fact. I think I also meant it as a decision. The second week was harder than the first. I want to be honest about that because I think there's a version of the story where everything softens gradually, where one good meal and one kind man and one room with real curtains is enough to start healing the larger wound. And there are moments that felt like that. There genuinely were. But the second week was when the shock wore off enough for the grief to find its actual shape. And grief, once it finds its shape, is not a gentle thing. It started on a Tuesday. I'd been at Adrian's for 9 days. We'd settled into something like a rhythm. Cautious but real, the way two people establish rhythm when they're both too old to be careless about it. I made breakfast, he made dinner, we shared the kitchen in the mornings with a comfortable absence of formality. I did my own laundry, I helped with dishes without being asked and without making it a statement. I was, in all the ways I knew how to be, a person trying not to take up more space than she needed while also, and this was the harder thing, trying to stop being so reflexively small. We talked. Every evening, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 3. The way people talk when they have 41 years of separate life to cover and find, unexpectedly, that they want to. He told me about the firm he'd built, not with pride exactly, but with the particular engagement of someone describing work they genuinely cared about. I told him about the library, the children's reading programs I'd run, the older patrons I checked on during the pandemic, the small ways that work had kept me anchored after Martin died. We were careful with each other, not cold. Careful, there's a difference. Cold is a wall. Careful is two people who have both been through enough to understand that the wrong move at the wrong moment can collapse something that hasn't fully formed yet. We were building something, and we both knew it was fragile, and so we were careful. But Tuesday was when Daniel called. Not a text this time. An actual phone call, which I hadn't had from him since before the fire, which in itself was information. I was in the guest room, sitting at the small desk I'd started using to organize my insurance paperwork, which had grown into a considerable stack over the past week, and my phone buzzed with his name, and I stared at it for 3 full rings before I picked up. Mom. His voice was different, not the managed, careful voice of the previous texts. Tighter. Something in it that I recognized from when he was small and upset about something he didn't know how to say. Danny, how are you? I'm fine. I wanted to check in. You haven't been responding to my texts much. I've been managing the insurance process. It takes a lot of time. I kept my voice neutral. Not warm, not cold, just factual. The assessment is scheduled for Thursday. Right, I know. A pause. Who is this friend that you're staying with? His name is Adrian Hale. I knew him a long time ago. Another pause. Longer. How long ago? Before I met your father. The silence on his end was a specific kind of silence. I could feel him recalibrating. I didn't know you kept in touch with people from back then, he said. I didn't, I said, not consistently. But you called him when he stopped after you left here. And there it was, the slight discomfort in after you left here, as if I'd done the leaving, as if I'd been the one who'd decided. I needed somewhere to go, I said simply. He offered. Mom, you could have called me if you were having second thoughts about the extended stay. Daniel. My voice came out level and quiet, the way it does when I found the floor beneath the surface. I didn't leave because of second thoughts about the extended stay. I left because I heard what Christine said. Dead silence. I let it breathe. I've spent my whole life rushing to fill silences, to smooth them over, to make the discomfort stop before it can force an honest conversation. I was done doing that. Mom, he started. I'm not calling it an accusation, I said. I'm calling it the truth. She said I was a problem to be managed. And you agreed by staying quiet. My voice was steady, which surprised me even as I spoke. I'm not angry, Danny. I understand You're in the middle of a marriage and a life, and your wife has opinions about how that life is organized. But I will not pretend I didn't hear what I heard. That's not something I'm willing to do anymore. Silence. And then in a voice that was very quiet and sounded very young, she was out of line. I closed my eyes briefly. Yes, I said, she was. I should have said that. I should have said it to her, and I should have said it to you, and I... He stopped. I could hear him breathing. I'm sorry, Mom. The apology landed somewhere real. I let it. I know you are, I said. I believe you. But sorry and different are two different things. And right now I'm in a good place with someone who's treating me well. And I need you to let me have that without making it complicated. Can you do that? A long pause. Who is he? This Adrian? Someone who answered his phone at 2 a.m. and didn't ask me what I needed him to be before he came. I said it without heat. That's who he is. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, are you okay, actually? I'm getting there, I said, which was honest. We said goodbye without resolving anything, because some things don't resolve in a single phone call, and the ones that matter rarely do. But when I hung up the phone, I sat at the desk with my hands flat on the insurance papers, and I noticed that I was not shaking. My voice had been steady throughout. My hands were steady now. That was new. Or maybe it was old. Maybe it was the version of me that existed before I'd spent 40 years ironing myself flat to fit inside other people's expectations. I couldn't tell which. Maybe it didn't matter. I was thinking about this when I heard Adrian in the hallway, a brief knock on the open door. He'd come to say dinner was ready, but when he saw my face, he stopped. Bad call? No, I said, and surprised myself by meaning it. Actually, I think it was a necessary one. He looked at me for a moment. Good, he said, just that, and then, chicken's done, and I didn't overcook it this time. I'll believe it when I see it, I said. He overcooked it again, just slightly, and we both pretended not to notice. That was Tuesday, and if Tuesday had been the only hard thing that week, the second week would have been manageable. Difficult but manageable. The kind of difficulty that is just ordinary human processing of an extraordinary situation. But Thursday was worse. Thursday was the insurance assessment. The adjuster's name was Mr. Fowler. He met me at the remains of the house, which I hadn't been back to since the morning of the fire. I'd asked Adrian to drive me, and he did, and when we turned onto my street and I saw the lot, the black skeleton of walls, the collapsed roof, the yellow tape, something happened to my breathing that I couldn't immediately control. It looked smaller, burned. That's what I wasn't prepared for. The house I'd lived in for 41 years, the house that had held my entire adult life, looked small and diminished inside its own destruction. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just small, just sad. Adrian put the car in park but didn't get out immediately. He looked at me. Do you want me to come? Please, I said. We walked across the lot with Mr. Fowler, who was efficient and genuinely kind in a way that felt real rather than professional, which I was grateful for. He explained the process as we walked. He pointed out structural elements and load-bearing walls and the probable point of origin of the electrical fault, a space inside the wall of the second bedroom, which happened to be the room where I'd kept all my photo albums, my journals, the shoebox of Martin's letters that I'd been keeping since 1987, the small watercolor my daughter-in-law had given me as a birthday gift 6 years ago before things between us had calcified into what they were now, all of it. The contents claim is separate from the structural, Mr. Fowler explained. You'll need to document as much as you can, receipts, photos if you have them, estimates for replacement value. The photos were inside, I said. He paused. Right, of course. In that case, bank records, credit card statements, any digital receipts you might have in email. I nodded. I knew how to do this. I was a competent woman and I knew how to do this. I made myself write notes in my notebook standing in the ash of my own former home, because writing things down is how I've always gotten through situations that are too large to hold all at once. What I didn't write down, but what I noticed, the kitchen door frame, still standing somehow, one of the few walls with enough structural integrity left, that it hadn't fully collapsed. Blackened, warped, structurally compromised, but standing, and on it, barely visible beneath the soot, the faintest traces of pencil lines, heights, dates, Danny's name written in my handwriting at different ages, the letters getting smaller as I ran out of room near the top. Daniel, 9, Daniel, 11, Daniel, 13. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Adrian stood next to me, not saying anything, not putting his hand on my arm or offering a comfort I hadn't asked for, just there, occupying the same air. I thought they were gone, I said. Still there, he said. Not for long. The whole thing's coming down. I know, a pause, but they're there right now. I looked at him. That's a strange comfort. Maybe, he said, but it's real. Mr. Fowler finished his assessment. The structural total loss was confirmed. The preliminary estimate on the structure itself would be in the range I'd hoped, enough to work with, enough that once the process completed I would have options. Real options, not desperation options. Time, patience, a functional claim. These things together meant that my $11,000 did not have to be the whole of my future. On the drive back I cried, finally, properly, the kind of crying that has been waiting behind the eyes for too long and comes out in a rush when the body decides it's waited long enough. I turned toward the window so Adrian wouldn't see the worst of it, which was a pointless instinct, since we were in a car and he was right there, but he let me have the pretense of it. He didn't say anything. He just drove. After a few minutes I wiped my face and said, "Sorry, don't." I was saving that apparently. It needed saving until you were ready, he said. You were ready now. I looked at my hands. I keep thinking about all the things that were in that house. Not the furniture, not the structure. The things. Martin's old flannel shirt that I kept in the back of the closet because it still smelled like him, 4 years after he died. My mother's ceramic pot, the one I moved in with. The journals. 40 years of journals. My voice went rough at the edges. I can't replace any of that. It's gone. Yes, he said simply. Not I'm sorry, and not at least you have, and not any of the dozen things people say when they don't know what to say. Just the honest acknowledgement of the loss. I appreciated that more than I could articulate. My father's watch is gone too, I said. I'd been meaning to get it serviced. The crystal was cracked. I kept putting it off. I stopped. I keep thinking about all the things I was putting off. That's the cruelest part, Adrian said. Not what you lost, what you meant to do with it. I looked at him. Ellen's garden, he said quietly. After she died, I couldn't go out there for 2 years. By the time I could, half of it was overgrown. I'd been meaning to tend it. Every week I'd think, next weekend, next month. He paused. You think there's always more time. And then there isn't. And then there isn't, he agreed. We drove the rest of the way in a quiet that was not empty. It was full of the particular understanding that happens between people who have both lost things and are being honest about the shape of that loss. When we got back to the house, he made tea. Not coffee, which surprised me, and I asked about it. He said he'd noticed I drank coffee in the mornings, but seemed to want something quieter in the evenings. So he'd bought tea. He said it the way you say something when you're not sure how it will land. And when I looked at him, I saw him watching my face to gauge the response. You noticed that, I said. I noticed things. You always did. The past came into the sentence without invitation, but neither of us flinched at it. We sat with our tea at the kitchen table, and the October evening settled outside the wide windows, and I said, "Tell me something I don't know about you, something real, not career or history, something you haven't told most people." He considered this. I'm afraid of flying. Have been since I was 42. I've flown anyway when I had to, but I've organized the last 20 years significantly around avoiding it. He paused. For an architect who theoretically understands structural load, it's somewhat embarrassing. It's not embarrassing, I said. It's human. Your turn. I thought about it. I applied to law school when I was 30. I had the scores. I had a letter of recommendation from the senior partner at the firm I'd worked at for 6 years. I never submitted the application. I turned my teacup. Martin wasn't discouraging. He didn't encourage. And I needed encouragement to do something that big, and I didn't get it, and so I didn't do it. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Do you regret it? Some days. I was honest. Not every day, but some days, yes. It's not too late, he said. I laughed. I'm 65. I know how old you are, he said mildly. I didn't say law school. I said it's not too late. Whatever the thing is under the law school, the wanting to be taken seriously, the wanting your intelligence to count for something in a room, that's not over. I looked at him for a long time. That's a very specific reading, I said. Am I wrong? I didn't answer, which was its own answer. He smiled very slightly and drank his tea. The second week passed into the third, and the third week was when things began to shift in ways I hadn't prepared myself for. It was subtle at first, the way the house stopped feeling like a place I was visiting and started feeling like a place I was in. My books arranged on the nightstand, a second coffee mug that had become mine by default, the blue one with the small chip at the rim, which I'd reached for first one morning and kept reaching for every morning after. Small things, the evidence of a life slowly re-establishing itself in a new space. Adrian and I had begun to take walks in the evening after dinner. His neighborhood was quiet, streets lined with old trees shedding their October leaves in the particular slow way of trees that have been doing this for decades and are not hurrying. We walked and we talked, or we didn't, and I began to notice that the walks I was most grateful for were the ones where we didn't, where we could just move through the evening together without needing to fill it. One evening, about 3 weeks in, we came back from a walk and sat on the back patio in the dark. It was cold enough for coats. He'd brought out 2 mugs without asking. Tea for me, coffee for him, which I registered without comment. The yard was dark except for the porch light and whatever the sky was doing with the last of the clouds. I was thinking about the law school application still, because some thoughts stay with you for days after they're said out loud for the first time. And I was thinking about Martin's flannel shirt and the journals and the hydrangea. And I was thinking about Daniel's voice on the phone, that very quiet, very young sound under the adult composure saying, I'm sorry, Mom. I was thinking about a lot of things. That's what the third week is, when you've been through something large. You're not in shock anymore, and you're not yet in acceptance, and so you're just in everything at once, all of it present and unresolved. Adrian, I said, do you ever feel like you wasted time? Not in the regret way, just objectively, looking at the years. Some of them were not wasted maybe, spent inefficiently. He was quiet for a while. Yes, he said, the years after Ellen died, 3, maybe 4 years. I was present in my life, but I wasn't inside it. I was going through the right motions, and none of them had any weight. What changed? I finished the house, he said, this house. I'd been building it in stages, and when Ellen got sick, I stopped. After she died, I made myself finish it. Took 2 years. It was the most deliberate thing I ever did. He looked up at the sky. I thought building a place I actually wanted to live would force me back into wanting to live there. Did it work? Slowly, he said, very slowly. A pause. What about you? Did you have years like that? The last 6 I was school, so 6, I said. The honesty of it surprised me even as I said it. Since the kids, since Daniel and Christine got settled and the grandchildren got older and stopped needing me to drive them places. The library work helped, but there were a lot of evenings that were quiet in the wrong way. Quiet because nothing was happening, not because I was at peace. Lonely, he said, not a question. Yes, I exhaled the word. I was lonely. I had a full enough life on the outside, but yes. He didn't respond immediately. I heard him set his mug down on the arm of the chair, and then he said, quietly, you don't have to be lonely now. The sentence was simple. It was not a declaration or a proposal or anything requiring an immediate response. It was just a fact, offered, an option placed on the table. I looked at the dark yard for a long time. I don't know what I'm doing, I said finally, with any of this. I don't know what we are. I'm 65 and I've been here 3 weeks and I'm in the middle of an insurance claim and my son and I are barely speaking and I stopped. I don't know what I'm doing. Neither do I, Adrian said, fully. That doesn't concern you. Not as much as it concerns you. He turned to look at me. You've been managing things so carefully your whole life. Being reasonable, being prepared. I think you've earned the right to not know something. I looked at him. The porch light was doing something soft to the angles of his face. He was old, we both were, and I was not going to pretend otherwise or dress it up as something it wasn't. But he was also very much himself, which is the rarest thing in a person at any age. I'm scared, I said, and saying it out loud, I realized it was the truest thing I'd said in weeks. Of what specifically? Not dismissive, genuinely asking. Of needing someone. I turned my tea mug in my hands. I haven't let myself need someone in a long time. I stopped after Martin. Not consciously, I just closed that down. Told myself I was being independent, self-sufficient. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from exactly this. Exactly what? I looked at him. From caring about someone and having them matter too much. The porch was quiet for a long moment. Evelyn, his voice was careful with it. I understand that. I spent 4 years after Ellen died not letting anything matter too much either. It's a reasonable response to loss. He paused. But I'm 68 years old and I've learned enough to know that protecting yourself from caring is not the same as being safe. It's just being alone with better justifications. I let that land. That's uncomfortably accurate, I said. I know, he said. I've had time to think about it. We sat in the dark for another few minutes, and then the cold that had been politely waiting at the edges made its presence undeniable, and we went inside. In the hallway, saying good night, there was a moment, brief, barely anything, just the pause before turning towards separate rooms, where I noticed that neither of us moved immediately, where we just stood there in the hallway with the porch light still on and the October night beyond the windows, and neither of us moved. I moved first. I said good night. I went to the guest room. I sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't write anything in my notebook. I just sat there and let the evening settle around me. All the things that had been said and a few things that hadn't, and I thought, this is the thing you've been afraid of. Not the fire, not Daniel. This. Someone looking at you and seeing you, all of you, the whole complicated, aging, imperfect, afraid, tired, hopeful, you and not looking away. I thought about Christine's face when I'd arrived at her door in my nightgown. The word inconvenience in her kitchen. The text about extended stay options and deposits, which were kind in their way, but which had a ceiling built into the kindness. And then I thought about a man who had answered his phone at 2 a.m, who had driven without conditions, who noticed which mug I preferred, who said, you don't have to be lonely now, like it was a simple thing, like it was just the next true thing after the other true things, no performance around it. I was still afraid. I want to be clear about that. The fear was real, and it had weight, and it was not the kind of fear that a few good conversations dissolves. Some fears have been built up over decades, and they require more than a few weeks and a blue mug and evening walks to undo. But I was also, underneath the fear, something else. Awake, maybe. In a way, I hadn't been for longer than I could clearly remember. Present in my own life in a way that had gone missing so gradually I hadn't noticed its absence until I felt it coming back. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I picked it up. A text from Daniel. Christine wants to apologize. She said I could tell you that. She's not great at this kind of thing, but she wanted you to know. I read it twice. I thought about Christine, her silk robe and her pour-over coffee and her composed precision. I thought about how hard it must have been for her to say that, or to let Daniel say it, which was its own kind of effort. People are not simple. Even the ones who've hurt you carry their own weights. their own reasons, their own damage that doesn't excuse the harm, but does complicate the story. I typed back, "Tell her I appreciate that, I mean it." Then I put the phone down. Then I picked it up again and typed, "I love you, Danny. We'll figure it out." Sent it before I could revise it. He responded almost immediately, just 3 words. "Love you too." I set the phone down for the last time and looked at the window where the curtains Adrian had chosen for this room, a quiet blue, nothing dramatic, were holding back the October night. 3 weeks ago, I had stood in my backyard in my nightgown and watched 41 years of my life compress into ash and structural loss. 3 weeks ago, my son had stood in his kitchen and said nothing while his wife called me a problem. 3 weeks ago, I had sat in room 14 of the Sycamore Inn with a cracked phone and $40 and a number I wasn't sure I'd have the nerve to call. And here I was, still here, with my blue mug and my corner of a house and the slow, tentative, imperfect beginning of something I didn't yet have the right name for. I wasn't healed. I want to be very honest about that. I was still in the middle of everything. The claim, the estrangement, the grief, the uncertainty about what came next. The loss of my house was not resolved by 3 weeks in someone else's, however welcome those weeks had been. A mother's relationship with her son is not repaired by 3 texts. And whatever was building between Adrian and me, carefully, cautiously, in the margins of an already complicated situation, was fragile in the way that new things are always fragile. None of it was fixed, but I was no longer operating from the bottom of a spiral. I was on ground that felt, if not firm, at least more solid than it had been. And that's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot when you consider where I'd started. I turned off the light. In the dark, I could hear the house settling around me. Those small sounds that houses make at night, the wood breathing with the temperature change, the particular quiet that belongs to rooms that are lived in rather than passed through. I had not heard sounds like that in 3 weeks. I had heard motel sounds and strangers' sounds and the ambient noise of someone else's life. These sounds were different. They felt tentatively and without certainty, and with more than a little of that old fear still present. They felt like something I might eventually call familiar. I noticed I'd stopped counting the days sometime around the 5th week. Not because I'd lost track, I'm not that far gone, but because the counting had become unnecessary. In the early days at Adrian's, I'd measured time the way you do when you're not sure how long you're allowed to stay somewhere, the way a house guest marks the calendar with invisible ink, tallying the nights, monitoring the threshold between welcome and worn out, day 1, day 4, day 9. The counting was its own kind of insecurity, a way of reminding myself not to get too comfortable, not to let the guest room become anything other than temporary. Somewhere around day 32 or 33, I stopped. I didn't decide to stop. I just noticed one morning that I'd made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the backyard without once calculating how many mornings I'd been doing that and without wondering how many more mornings I was owed. I was just there, in the morning, with my blue chip mug and the particular quality of November light coming through the windows, thin and silver and honest, the way late autumn light always is. It was a small thing. But small things are how real change announces itself, not in declarations or dramatic moments. Those are the visible tip of something much larger and slower moving underneath. The insurance claim had progressed. The adjuster's report had come through at the end of the 4th week, and the numbers were better than I'd feared, and worse than I'd hoped, which is the exact formula that constitutes a functional reality rather than either catastrophe or windfall. I had enough, combined with my savings, to make choices. Not unlimited choices. I'm not a woman who deals in unlimited anything but real ones. I could look for a place to rent while I figured out what came next. I could take my time about it, do it carefully, not grab the first available option out of desperation. Adrian had said nothing about me leaving. He had also said nothing about me staying. This was deliberate, I understood. He was giving me room to make my own decisions without the pressure of his preferences shaping them, which was thoughtful and also, if I'm being fully honest, slightly maddening, because there are moments when you want someone to say, please don't go, rather than leave the entire question open like a window in November. But I understood why he didn't, and I respected it, which is not the same as finding it easy. The 5th week brought 2 things I hadn't anticipated. The first was Christine. Daniel had texted me that she wanted to call. I had held that information for 3 days before responding, not out of cruelty, but because I needed to understand what I actually wanted from such a conversation before I had it. What I wanted from Christine was not an apology I could hold over her head. I have no interest in that. What I wanted, when I was honest about it, was to be spoken to like a person rather than a category, like a woman rather than a problem. That's a reasonable thing to want from your son's wife. It should not require a house fire and a month apart to produce. She called on a Wednesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen helping Adrian untangle a very bad situation with a bechamel sauce, which I will not detail except to say that it involved too much flour and a certain amount of pan-specific optimism on his part. I stepped out to the back patio to take the call. Evelyn. Her voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Not composed, not measured, just tired. The way people sound when they've put down something heavy they'd been carrying at arm's length. Christine, I said, I owe you an apology. She said it quickly, like she'd been rehearsing the opening and needed to get through it before she lost the momentum. What I said, what Daniel told you I said, and it was wrong. I was thinking out loud about things I should have kept to myself, and I was... A pause. I was scared. That surprised me. Of what? Of... She stopped again. This was not a woman who stopped easily. I'd never seen her uncertain about a sentence before. Of losing our routine. Of things changing. Of... I don't know how to say this without sounding terrible. Say it anyway, I said. I sat down in one of the patio chairs, the cold of it coming through my slacks. I'd rather have the true version. I've always felt like I was competing with you, she said finally. For Daniel, for his attention, I guess, his loyalty. And I know that sounds ridiculous, you're his mother, but... She exhaled. When you needed help and he wanted to give it, I felt it like a threat. That's not your fault, that's mine. I know it's mine. I sat with that for a moment. There are 2 ways to receive that kind of honesty. You can take it as a weapon. Here is the vulnerability she's exposed. Use it. Or you can take it as what it actually is, a human being telling you something true and difficult because they've decided finally to try. Christine, I said carefully, I've never wanted to be your competition. I've never wanted anything from Daniel's marriage except for both of you to be happy in it. Silence. I know, she said quietly. I know that now. I think I knew it before, and it was easier to pretend I didn't. What changed? I asked. Emma asked about you. Her voice shifted. My daughter. She asked why Grandma Evelyn wasn't coming for Thanksgiving, and Daniel... She stopped. Daniel didn't know what to say, and I watched him not know what to say, and I thought, this is what I did. This is the consequence of what I did, sitting right here at the breakfast table. Another pause. That's not the person I want to be. Emma, my granddaughter, 8 years old, with Daniel's jaw and my eyes and a laugh that had belonged to Martin, the one who used to call me on random Tuesday afternoons to tell me about her day at school until the calls had slowly tapered, and I told myself it was just because kids got busier, not because the atmosphere around those calls had changed. The backs of my eyes went hot for the second time in the story, and unlike the first time, I let it happen. Tell her I'll call her, I said. My voice was unsteady. Tell Emma I'll call her this week. Okay? Christine's voice was rough at the edges. Evelyn, I'm sorry, for real, not the polished version, the real one. I know, I said, I hear it. We didn't resolve everything in that call. Some things between Christine and me would take longer. Shared meals and small gestures, and the slow accumulation of evidence that people are capable of being different than they've been. That's not a 30-minute phone call's work, but the 30-minute phone call was the beginning of the work, and beginnings matter. When I came back inside Adrian looked at my face and didn't ask. He handed me a bowl of pasta. The bechamel situation had been remedied, more or less, and we sat at the kitchen table and I told him about it. He listened. At the end he said, "How do you feel?" "Tired," I said, "and something else. I can't name it." "Lighter," he said. I thought about it. "Yes, actually. Yes. That's what it feels like when you put something down," he said. "You forget how heavy it was until you're not carrying it." I looked at him across the table. "You're very good at this." "At what?" "At saying the right thing without making it sound like you're trying to say the right thing." He considered this. "I've had a lot of practice at getting it wrong first," he said. "You just didn't know me during those years." The second unexpected thing that fifth week arrived not as a conversation but as a letter. A physical letter in an envelope with a return address I didn't immediately recognize, forwarded to me from my old address to Daniel's, and then from Daniel's to Adrian's, following me through the chain of my displacement, like a piece of mail determined to find me, no matter how much my life had moved around. I opened it at the kitchen table one morning, while Adrian was at a consult meeting. The return address was a law firm in the city, which I knew from the letterhead to be a real firm, the kind with old money and quiet offices and partners who've been partners for decades. The letter was from the estate of a woman named Ruth Bellamy. Ruth Bellamy had been my mother's closest friend, a connection going back to when my mother was 22 and Ruth was 25, and they'd worked together in the same seamstress shop for 6 years. Ruth had outlived my mother by 14 years and had apparently outlived most of the people she'd cared about. She had died 7 weeks ago at 91, and her estate, being divided among a small list of people she'd chosen specifically, included a bequest to me. The amount in the letter made me read the sentence 3 times. $40,000. Not life-changing money in the grand sweep of things. Not the kind of money that reorders a person's circumstances entirely, but layered on top of the insurance settlement and my existing savings. It was the difference between options and real options. The difference between renting something modest and waiting anxiously versus having a foundation. Between being someone who was getting through it and someone who was genuinely going to be all right. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in my hands, and I thought about Ruth Bellamy, whom I'd last seen at my mother's funeral 15 years ago, a small woman in a grey coat who had held my hand for a long time without saying anything, and had told me when she finally spoke that my mother had been the finest person she'd ever known. I thought about what it means to be remembered in someone's will, not for obligation, not from guilt, but as an act of deliberate affection, a choice made with full knowledge and clear intention. Someone had thought of me, had planned for me, had quietly, without my knowledge, decided that I deserved to land somewhere soft. I called Adrian, which surprised me even as I did it. He was my first call without deliberation, my hand reaching for the phone and dialing before my brain had quite caught up with the impulse. "Something happened," I said when he picked up. "Good something or bad something?" "Good, I think. I need to read you this letter." He listened while I read it. When I finished, there was a brief silence, and then he said, "Evelyn, that's wonderful." "It feels strange," I said, "to receive something like this when I haven't seen her in 15 years. "She thought of you," he said. "People carry more people in their hearts than they show. She carried you. That's not strange. That's just love, the way it actually works. Quiet and consistent, and sometimes it doesn't speak up until the very end." I held the letter in my lap and looked at the kitchen window, the bare November trees beyond the glass. "I can get my own place now," I said, "a real one. I have enough." A pause on his end. "Yes," he said, "you do." And there it was, the open window again. No, please stay. No, don't go. Just the acknowledgement of my capability, my autonomy, my right to use my resources how I chose. I couldn't tell if I found it admirable or agonizing. Probably both. "I'm going to look," I said. "Starting next week, I want to be honest about that." "I know," he said, "and I'll help you look if you want." "You do that?" "Evelyn." His voice was dry and fond simultaneously. I'm an architect. It would physically pain me to let you evaluate properties without me. Something in my chest loosened enough that I laughed. All right, I said. Fine. I'll have opinions about load-bearing walls. I'm sure you will. They will be correct opinions. That remains to be seen, I said, and hung up. The property search started that following Monday and was, in the way of all practical real estate endeavors, both clarifying and tedious. We looked at 7 places over the course of 2 weeks. Adrian was, as promised, opinionated about structural integrity and window placement and the particular way a room holds light or fails to. He was also, in the way I'd come to expect, genuinely useful rather than just present, pointing out things I wouldn't have noticed, asking questions I wouldn't have thought to ask. The 4th property was a small house, not large, a 2-bedroom bungalow on a quiet street with a yard that had been neglected but not ruined. The kitchen was older than I'd ideally have wanted, and one of the bathroom fixtures needed replacing, but the bones were good. Adrian said this with the authority of a man who knows what bones mean in a structure. And the light through the back windows was extraordinary, the kind of particular warm afternoon light that a room either has or doesn't, and you can't manufacture. I stood in the middle of the living room and felt something I recognized from 41 years ago, standing in the doorway of a different house with 2 suitcases and a ceramic pot. Not the same feeling. I was a different person now, with different knowledge and different wounds and a different understanding of what home means, but adjacent to it. The feeling of a space waiting to be lived in, of walls that haven't yet heard your voice but might be willing to. What do you think? Adrian said from behind me. I turned around slowly. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, face professionally neutral in the way that meant he already had thoughts. What do you think? I said. I think the foundation is solid, and someone installed that kitchen in 1994 and never updated it, and the previous owner should be slightly embarrassed about the bathroom, but structurally the house is sound and the light is... He stopped, looked at the windows. The light is something. It is, I said. You could put a garden in the back, he said. The soil's probably workable. Give it a season. I looked at the back windows. The yard beyond them was winter bare, brown grass and a few overgrown shrubs, but I could see what it could be. I've always been able to see what things could be, which is both a gift and a curse, because sometimes things don't become what you can see in them, and you have to grieve the distance between the real and the possible. I could plant a hydrangea, I said, quietly, half to myself. I heard him shift behind me. You could plant 10 of them, he said. I turned to look at him. He was watching me with that expression I'd come to recognize over the past weeks, the one that wasn't trying to be anything. Not strategic, not performed, just honest attention. Adrian, I said, I'm going to make an offer on this house. Okay, he said, and when I move into it, I stopped, looked at the light on the floor, looked back at him. I don't want things to change. Between us, I don't entirely know what I want, but I don't want it to stop. The room was very quiet. He walked across the space between us, not quickly. He moved the way he did everything, with that deliberate, unhurried quality that was not slowness but intention. And when he was close enough that I had to look up slightly to see his face, he said, I was not planning to let it stop. You could have said that, I said, earlier. You could have said that 2 weeks ago. I know, he said. I was giving you room to choose. It's very noble, I said. It was also extremely frustrating. I know that too. The corner of his mouth. I'm sorry. You're not sorry, I said. No, he admitted, not entirely. I looked at him, 68 years old, white-haired, with laugh lines and a careful patience and an architect's eye for what a space could hold. Not perfect. He overcooked chicken and avoided flying and had given me 3 weeks of open windows, when what I'd actually needed was for someone to close one of them and say this direction, Evelyn. Come this way, but real. Genuinely real. The kind of real that takes a long time to find and is worth every year of the finding. I'm going to make the offer, I said, and then I'm going to go back to your house and have dinner, and at some point we are going to have a conversation about what we actually are to each other, a real one with complete sentences. Yes, he said, we are. And you're going to help me find someone to update that kitchen, obviously, and you're going to have opinions about it. Extremely specific opinions, he said, correct ones. We'll see, I said, the same thing I'd said on the phone, and his face did the thing it did when I said that, a brief, unguarded thing that was almost a smile, but warmer. I made the offer that afternoon. The sellers responded the next morning. There was a brief negotiation. I was not going to pay over asking for a kitchen from 1994. Adrian backed me up on this with technical specificity that was both impressive and slightly terrifying. And we reached a number I could stand behind without anxiety. The house would be mine in 6 weeks. That evening at dinner, Adrian opened a bottle of wine that had been in his rack for a while. Something he'd been saving for an occasion he said he'd never quite identified until now. And we sat at his kitchen table with the November dark outside the windows, and we drank it slowly over the course of a long meal and talked about things that were not the insurance claim and not the negotiation and not any of the practical architecture of survival. We talked about music, about a trip he'd been thinking about for years to the southwest, the landscape architecture of the desert, the way humans build in extreme climates. I told him about a novel I'd read 3 times over the past decade, one of those books that keeps having new things in it depending on where you are in your own life. He told me about a piece of music, the one he'd mentioned weeks ago, the one that kept defeating him, and played a small portion of it on his phone, sitting across the kitchen table watching my face as I listened. I hear it, I said. It keeps almost resolving and then not. Yes. He looked relieved in a very specific way. That's exactly it. It keeps almost resolving. Maybe that's the point, I said. Maybe it's not meant to resolve. He was quiet for a moment. Some things aren't, he said. We looked at each other across the table with the wine and the dinner and the November dark, and I thought, some things that don't resolve aren't failures. Some things hold their tension because the tension is the truth of them. The ongoing aliveness of something that keeps mattering, keeps moving, keeps finding new rooms inside itself. I was 65 years old and I had lost my house and I had lost the version of motherhood I'd believed in, and I had found, in the rubble of all that loss, something I hadn't looked for and couldn't have planned. Not rescued. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I was not a woman who had been saved by a man. I was a woman who had saved herself and made the call, walked out the door, stood at the burned remains of her own life and made the offer and negotiated the kitchen from 1994 and chosen, actively chose, not to fold herself up into the shape of whatever space other people were willing to give her. Adrian had not saved me. He had been there while I saved myself. And that distinction I was learning is the whole difference between love that diminishes and love that doesn't. Emma called that Friday. Her voice came through the phone, bright and specific. The way children's voices are when they're telling you something they actually care about. Not the polished for adults version, but the real one. She told me about a project she was doing at school, about architecture. I made a mental note about that. And about her friend Lily, who had said something that wasn't very nice. And about the dog they'd seen at the park that had 3 legs and ran faster than most dogs with 4. Grandma Evelyn, she said near the end, are you coming for Thanksgiving? I paused for only a moment. I'm going to try, I said. I really am. Mom said she hoped you would, Emma said, matter-of-factly. The way children deliver information that adults have spent weeks agonizing over. She did? She said it would be nice. A pause. Also, Tyler broke the good salad bowl and we're not supposed to tell, but I just told you so. I laughed. A real one, the kind that starts in the stomach. I won't say a word, I said. Grandma Evelyn, is it true you have a friend who's an architect? I looked across the kitchen where Adrian was reading and not reading, his eyes periodically moving from the page to wherever I was in the room, a habit I'd noticed forming over the past weeks and had not mentioned. Yes, I said, I do. My project is about bridges, Emma said. Do you think he would know about bridges? I think, I said, that he would have extremely specific opinions about bridges. Cool, she said, with the total confidence of an 8-year-old who has gotten what she wanted. Okay, I gotta go. Bye, Grandma Evelyn. Bye, sweetheart. The call ended. I held the phone for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Adrian had set his book all the way down. That sounded like it went well, he said. My granddaughter wants to know if you have opinions about bridges, I said. He sat up straighter. I have very detailed opinions about bridges. I told her as much. Suspension versus cable stayed alone is a 20-minute conversation. She's 8, I said. Maybe start with something shorter. Cantilevers, he said immediately. Children love cantilevers. I looked at him. This man who had opinions about cantilevers and load-bearing walls and kitchen fixtures from 1994 and the particular quality of afternoon light in a room, who'd kept a space warm for someone he hadn't spoken to in 4 decades, who cooked from scratch and read real books and said you don't have to be lonely now without any performance around it. Something settled in my chest. Not the relief of crisis passing. I'd felt that weeks ago. This was quieter, warmer, more permanent in its texture. It felt, I thought, a little like the beginning of home. Not the house I'd lost, not even the small bungalow I'd just put an offer on. Something less architectural than that and more essential. The home that exists between people, when they've chosen each other honestly and without conditions, when they've been seen in full and not looked away from. I had not expected at 65, with ash on the ground behind me, and nothing but a suitcase and a cracked phone, to find my way back to something like this. But here I was, still here. And for the first time since 2:14 in the morning, on the night everything burned, I was not just surviving the hour, I was inside my own life, fully, finally, with both hands. The bungalow closed on a Thursday in December, 17 days before Christmas, and I stood in the empty living room with the keys in my hand and let the silence of it settle over me like something earned. It smelled like fresh paint and old wood and the particular cold, dry smell of a house that hasn't been lived in for a few months, waiting for someone to bring heat back into it. The afternoon light came through the back windows exactly the way it had the first time I'd stood here. That particular warm golden slant that belongs to winter afternoons, low and long, and somehow more honest than summer light, which always promises more than it delivers. Adrian was behind me, quiet. He'd driven me to the closing, sat in the hallway outside the title company's conference room for 40 minutes, while I signed approximately 1 document for every year I'd been alive, and said nothing when I came out except how does it feel, and accepted strange and good as a complete answer, which it was. Now, he stood in my new living room with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the space with the particular attention of a man who sees rooms differently than most people do, not just what's there, but what the structure wants to be, where the light wants to go, what a person's daily life would do inside these walls. Kitchen first, he said, before you bring anything in. The countertops need to come out, I know. The original tile underneath is probably intact. Might be worth keeping. Adrian, I turned to look at him. I know, we talked about this. You drew me a diagram. I drew you 2 diagrams, he said. The second one was more accurate. I kept the first one. He looked at me. Why? Because you drew it on a paper bag at breakfast, and you were very serious about it, and it was... I stopped. It was sweet in a very non-sweet way. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I can live with that. We walked through the house together, which we'd done before, but which felt different now that it was actually mine. Every room received a fresh look. The bedroom with its eastern window that would get morning light, the smallest second bedroom that I was already thinking of as the room for Emma and Tyler when they stayed over, The bathroom Adrian had opinions about that I was only partially prepared to hear in their entirety. The backyard was winter dormant and looked worse than it had in November, but I could see under it the architecture of a proper garden. The bones of beds that had once been tended. "Next spring," I said, looking through the kitchen window at the yard. "What are you thinking?" "Hydrangeas along the back fence." I paused. "And tomatoes, even though they never come out right." "Maybe they'll come out right here," he said. "They won't," I said, "but I'll try them anyway." And he was quiet for a moment. "That's actually the correct attitude towards tomatoes," he said finally. We left the bungalow at dusk, the December dark coming early and completely, and I locked the front door with my key. My key, that specific sensation of a lock turning under your own hand, and stood on the front step for a moment before getting in the car. The street was quiet. Christmas lights on a few of the neighboring houses, the modest kind, nothing ostentatious. A neighbor across the street walking a large beige dog, who paused to evaluate me with serious eyes before moving on. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Adrian said dryly from the car. "The dog approved," I said, "the important constituency." He laughed, a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine. I got in the car. The plan had been to go to his house for dinner. We'd been doing this, the long transition period between my staying there and moving into my own place, with the natural ease of people who have stopped needing to define every arrangement before they can live inside it. I had boxes in his spare room. I had a houseplant I'd bought on an impulse that was living on his kitchen windowsill because the light there was better. I had, in a way, I'd been careful not to examine too directly, 2 homes simultaneously, which is an unusual thing to have after months of having none. We were 20 minutes from his house when my phone rang. Daniel's name on the screen. I had seen him 3 weeks ago at Thanksgiving, which had been not easy, but real. Christine had made more effort than I'd expected, which I'd acknowledge without making it into a larger statement than it needed to be. Emma had spent 45 minutes asking Adrian about bridges, which had clearly been the highlight of his November, though he'd affected nonchalance about it. Tyler had shown me a card trick that didn't quite work, and been deeply committed to the performance anyway, which had made me love him unreasonably. Daniel and I had talked slowly and carefully in the kitchen after dinner, while Christine took the kids upstairs, and we'd said some things that needed saying, and left other things for later, because that's how real repair works. Not all at once, not in a single charged moment, but incrementally over time with patience on both sides. But this was December, and Daniel calling on a Thursday evening without a preceding text was new information. "Hey, Danny." "Mom," something in his voice. Tight, the way it had been on that first call after the fire, but different. Not guilt this time, something else. "Are you busy?" "I just closed on the house. I'm in the car. What's wrong?" A pause. "Nothing's wrong exactly. I need to tell you something, and I didn't want to do it over text." Adrian was driving with his eyes on the road, but I could see his attention had shifted. He was not listening in the intrusive way. He was listening the way people do when they're being careful not to shape a situation they're adjacent to. "Tell me," I said. "Christine and I have been talking," Daniel said, "about what happened this fall, all of it, a breath. We've been seeing someone, a therapist, couples therapy. We've been going for about 6 weeks. I was quiet. "I know that's not something you'd necessarily... I don't know why I'm telling you, except..." He stopped. "The therapist asked us to think about the people in our lives we'd treated badly. She asked us to think about what we were actually afraid of. And I kept coming back to you and the house and the way Christine said what she said and the way I didn't stop it." "Daniel, I'm not calling for absolution," he said quickly. "I know that's not how this works. I'm calling because I wanted you to know that I understand now what happened, what I did, and I want to do it differently. Not just say it, do it." The car moved through the December dark, street lights coming on one by one. Adrian kept his eyes forward. "That matters to me," I said, "more than I can say quickly. I know I can't undo it, he said. I know what you heard in that kitchen. I know what it felt like to be asked to leave. His voice went rough. To be made to feel like leaving was your idea. I knew it wasn't. And I let it happen anyway, and I don't have an excuse for that holds up. No, I said gently, you don't. I'm sorry, Mom, the real version, not the extended stay on Maple Avenue version. His voice broke on it, slightly, which was the most honest thing I'd heard from him in years. The real one, my son, 38 years old and the owner of a jaw like his father's, and eyes like mine, calling from his kitchen in December to tell me the true thing finally. Not perfectly, not without the evidence of how long it had taken him to get there, but truly. I know, I said, I hear it. Christine wants to come to see the new house. When you're ready for that, a pause. She chose a plant. She wants to bring you a housewarming plant. She wanted me to ask if that was okay before she just showed up with it, which he made a sound that was almost a laugh, which is more self-awareness than she's historically shown, so I'm calling it progress. Something moved in my chest. The complicated, layered thing that only exists in family relationships. The love that is also sometimes the wound, the forgiveness that is also sometimes the fence, the hope that coexists with the clear-eyed understanding of who people have been and the open question of who they might become. Tell her yes, I said. When I'm ready for visitors, a few weeks, let me get settled. Okay. The relief in his voice was quiet but real. Okay, and Mom, he stopped. This Adrian, I'd like to meet him, properly, when that makes sense. I glanced at Adrian beside me. He was very carefully examining the road. That can be arranged, I said. Is he? Daniel seemed to search for the right question. Is he good to you? I looked at Adrian. He was still looking at the road, but I saw something in the line of his jaw, the particular stillness of a man pretending not to be aware that he is being discussed. Yes, I said, he is. Good, Daniel said, and then quietly, like he was saying something he'd been holding for a while. You deserve that. I don't think I said that enough. You deserve someone who's good to you. I let that sit in the car for a moment. Thank you, Danny. We said goodbye. I held the phone in my lap after the call ended, watching the streetlights pass. He seems to be finding his way, Adrian said. Careful, neutral. He does, I said. Slowly, I paused. He wants to meet you. Adrian was quiet for a beat. How do you feel about that? Terrified, I said honestly, and ready, both at once. I can do terrified and ready, he said. That's well within my range. I turned to look at him. When did you become someone I tell everything to? Somewhere around the 3rd week, he said. I think it was the Tuesday with the insurance call. You came out of that room and your shoulders were down for the first time since the fire, and I thought, oh, there she is, the real one. I looked at him for a long moment. Adrian, I said, I need to have that conversation now. The one I said we'd have with complete sentences. He glanced at me, then back at the road. Now? We're in a car. You can't walk away. I was not planning to walk away. Good, I said. Then now. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, all right, you start. You first, I said. You've had more time to prepare. I genuinely haven't, he said. Every time I thought about how to start it, I changed my mind about the opening. So you have been thinking about it. Constantly, he said. For weeks. It's been somewhat distracting. Tell me, I said, whatever the opening is. The car moved through the dark. He took a breath. I told you I kept track of you over the years. What I didn't tell you, what I wasn't ready to say then, is that I never stopped caring about what happened to you. Not in a consuming way. Not in a way that made me incapable of living my own life, but as a constant. The way certain people become a constant in you. I loved Ellen genuinely. That's true. But there was always a part of me that had not finished something with you. That had a door I'd left open because I couldn't figure out how to close it without it feeling like a lie. I was very still. When you called, he said, at 2 a.m. from that motel, I didn't even hesitate. I didn't think about it. I just knew. that I was going and that it mattered, and that after 41 years I was not going to stand on the other side of that phone call and do nothing. He paused. That's the opening. That's the truest version of it. The streetlights kept passing. I waited until I was sure I could speak without my voice doing something undignified. I chose Martin, I said. You know that. I'm not going to pretend it was the wrong choice, because I loved him and I had a life with him that mattered. But the reason I chose him over you had nothing to do with loving him more. I stopped. I was afraid of what you asked of me. To be fully present. To be fully seen. I wasn't ready for that at 24. I told myself it was simpler than that, but it wasn't. I know, he said quietly. I'm not that person anymore, I said. I'm not the person who needs to make herself smaller to feel safe. I think losing the house did something to that. It stripped out the last of the infrastructure I'd been using to stay comfortable and careful, and what was left was just me, actual me, without the management. I paused. I'm 65 years old and I just bought a house with a bad kitchen, and I'm going to plant tomatoes that won't come out right, and I have no interest in being careful anymore. Not in the old way. The car slowed. He was pulling over, I realized, into a quiet residential street. Not his neighborhood, just somewhere to stop. He put the car in park. He turned to look at me. Say what you're trying to say, he said, with the complete sentence. I love you, I said. I think I have for a long time, in whatever form that could take, given the circumstances. And I'm done managing that into something more acceptable. The quiet of the car was very complete. Then he said, I love you too. I've been in love with you since 1983, with whatever interruptions life required, and I don't have any interest in pretending otherwise. I looked at him. This man, this utterly specific, somewhat stubborn, endlessly patient, slightly overconfident about kitchens man, who had driven 40 minutes in the early morning and asked nothing in return, who had given me room and time and a blue-chipped mug, and evenings that turned into nights without either of us noticing, who had stood in the ruins of my burned house and said the marks were in you before they were in the wood. Okay, I said. Okay, he agreed. That was the conversation, I said, apparently. I thought it would be longer. We've been having it for 2 months, he said. That was just the last part. I looked at him for another moment, and then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I stopped calculating, stopped measuring, stopped managing. I leaned across the car and I put my hand against his face and I kissed him, there in the parked car on a quiet December street with the Christmas lights of someone's house making red and green patterns on the windshield. It was not a young kiss. It was not practiced or perfect. It was two old people who had taken the long way around and arrived somewhere real, and it tasted like all the years in between, and nothing like regret. When we pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine for a moment. Took us long enough, I said. I have an architecture joke about that, he said. Please don't. Something about load-bearing moments. Adrian. Fine, he said. Later. He started the car again. We drove the rest of the way to his house in a different kind of quiet. Full rather than careful. Warm rather than cautious. I held his hand on the console and watched the December dark roll past the windows, and I thought about how strange and specific and impractical the way things actually work out is, compared to the ways we plan them. The weeks between the closing and Christmas were loud with practical work. The kitchen renovation Adrian had planned in 2 diagrams took 12 days, during which we ate takeout at his kitchen table and argued pleasantly about tile choices. I wanted the original tile underneath, which turned out to be a pale sage green that Adrian declared structurally sound and aesthetically correct. I declared it lovely. We were briefly insufferable about agreeing on it. The bathroom was addressed, a new fixture installed. The beige carpeting in the second bedroom came out to reveal hardwood underneath that needed refinishing but was genuinely beautiful, warm-toned and solid. I moved in on December 21st, the winter solstice, which I chose half by coincidence and half by a sense that the longest night of the year was the right time to start filling a new space with light. Adrian helped carry boxes. He had opinions about where things should go, and I overruled approximately 40% of them, and we reached comfortable compromises on the remaining 60. My books went on the shelves in the living room, organized by the system I've used for 20 years, which is partially alphabetical and partially emotional, and which no one but me fully understands. The blue chipped mug went in the kitchen cabinet next to the other mugs, because it was mine and it belonged with my things now. The 2 blouses I'd hung in Adrian's guest room closet in those first desperate days went in my own closet, and I stood there looking at them for a moment before I closed the door, thinking about the woman who had packed them without thinking, grabbing the nearest things by firelight. That woman had packed better than she knew. I called Emma that evening when the boxes were partially unpacked and the rooms were still figuring out what they were. She asked approximately 15 questions about the house, several of which I couldn't yet answer because I hadn't decided, and told me that Tyler had broken another bowl, but this one wasn't the good one, so it was less of an incident. She asked if Mr. Adrian was going to be at Christmas. "We'll see," I said. "Mom says maybe," Emma said, which usually means yes. "Your mother is perceptive," I said. "She says that too," Emma said. Christine had texted that afternoon a photo of a plant, a large healthy pothos in a terracotta pot, with a message that said, "For when you're ready, no pressure on timing." Then, after a pause, a second text. "It's a good plant. I've had it for 2 years. I thought you should have something that's already survived a while. I read it 3 times. Then I typed back, 'Bring it at Christmas. I'll make room for it.'" Her response was a single heart emoji, which was the most unguarded thing I'd ever seen Christine send, and which I chose to understand as exactly what it was. Christmas came the way Christmas does when you've been through a hard year, with the particular tenderness that difficult years lend to ordinary celebrations. Daniel and Christine and the children came to the bungalow, which was still partly unpacked but warm, with a tree I'd bought last minute and decorated haphazardly with a box of ornaments I'd kept in a storage unit for exactly this eventuality. Some of them were old, not as old as the ones I'd lost in the fire, but old enough to carry something. Daniel's handprint in clay from 3rd grade cracked across the palm, but holding. A glass ball Martin had bought the first Christmas we were married, which I'd taken out of the storage unit and held for a moment before putting it carefully on the tree. Adrian came. He arrived with wine and a very specific cheese he'd been insistent about, and a slightly battered cookbook he'd found at a used bookstore and thought I might want, which I did. He shook Daniel's hand, which was a moment I watched from the kitchen doorway. 2 men measuring each other in the way men do, not hostile but careful. Daniel was a head taller. Adrian was older by nearly 3 decades. They stood there for a few seconds, and then Daniel said something I couldn't hear from the doorway, and Adrian laughed. And whatever the measurement had been, it came out satisfactory on both sides. Christine gave me the pothos. I put it in the kitchen window in the same position as Adrian's houseplant had lived at his place, because the light there was right, and because I liked the continuity of it. Emma cornered Adrian about bridges within 20 minutes, which he clearly found delightful, and they spent a considerable portion of the afternoon at the kitchen table with Emma's notebook, while she interviewed him with the specific intensity of an 8-year-old who has decided something matters. I made tea and listened from nearby and watched my granddaughter's face light up at whatever he was telling her, and I thought, this is what a life is supposed to have room for. Tyler showed Adrian a card trick. It still didn't work. Adrian played along with complete sincerity, which Tyler deeply appreciated. Daniel found me alone in the kitchen in the late afternoon, while Christine was in the living room with the kids, and Adrian was examining the kitchen renovation with proprietary satisfaction. "It's a good house," Daniel said. "It is," I said. "The kitchen is... Was this all him?" He gestured at the renovation. "It was collaborative," I said. He had stronger opinions about the tile than I did. "The tile is good," Daniel said. "I know," I said. I agreed with him on the tile. He was quiet for a moment, leaning against the counter the way he used to lean against my counter as a teenager. That particular posture that means he's thinking about something he's not sure how to say. "He looks at you," Daniel said finally. "What?" "Adrian, he looks at you." He paused. In a way that he stopped. "Dad looked at you like that. Not always, but sometimes. Like you were the thing in the room that mattered." My throat tightened. "Danny," I said, I'm not making it into something. He looked at his hands. "I just want you to know that I see it, and I think it's good. I think you deserve it." His voice went rough at the edges. "I should have been the one to make you feel like that these past months. Like you mattered, like you were the thing in the room." I crossed the kitchen and I put my arms around my son. He was a full foot taller than me, and he stood there for a moment like he'd forgotten this was an option. And then his arms came around me and he held on. "You're learning," I said into his shoulder. "That's enough." "I'm slow," he said. "You're mine," I said. "I've got time." We stayed like that for a moment, the two of us in my new kitchen, with the sage green tile and the pothos in the window, and the smell of whatever Adrian had volunteered to cook drifting from the other room. Then we let go, and Daniel cleared his throat and went to check on the kids. The way men in our family have always redirected emotion into motion, which is a limitation and also sometimes a grace. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the winter yard. Dead grass and bare branches and the skeleton of what the garden would be. Spring was 4 months away. I had learned this year that 4 months is nothing. 4 months is a blink. 4 months ago, I had been standing in my backyard watching my life burn. And now I had sage green tile and a pothos with a history, and a man in my living room explaining suspension bridges to my granddaughter. Time does what it does. You don't always get to choose the direction, but you get to choose what you do when it drops you somewhere unexpected. I chose this. Adrian proposed on a Tuesday in February, which is not a romantic month and not a particularly romantic day of the week. And he did it in the most Adrian way imaginable. At the kitchen table, over the slightly overcooked chicken that had become a running joke between us, with a ring he'd had in his pocket for 3 weeks because he hadn't been sure of the right moment and had eventually concluded there wasn't one, just moments, and this was the one he was in. He didn't get down on one knee. He was 68 years old, and he said afterward, without apology, that his knees had opinions about cold floors in February, which I accepted as a completely reasonable position. He slid the ring across the table and said, "I would like to keep doing this, indefinitely, with the formal arrangement that implies." I looked at the ring, simple, not small, chosen with an architect's understanding of proportion and an old man's understanding of what actually lasts. "The chicken is overcooked again," I said. "I know," he said. "I was distracted." "You've been carrying that ring for 3 weeks," I said. "How distracted could you have been?" "Fairly distracted," he said. "Yes or no, Evelyn?" I looked at him across the kitchen table in my bungalow in February, with the pothos growing in the window and the sage green tile behind him, and the ring sitting there between us like the simplest fact in the world. "Yes," I said, "obviously, yes." He put the ring on my finger, and we ate the overcooked chicken and opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving for something, and we didn't call anyone that night. We sat at the table and talked until it was late, and the February dark was complete outside the windows, and at some point he said something that made me laugh so hard my face hurt, and I thought, this is the thing I was protecting myself from. This specific, ordinary, unrepeatable evening, this man, this table, this life. I had been so afraid of needing someone that I'd nearly missed what it felt like to choose someone. And those are not the same thing at all. We married in April, 8 months after the fire. Small ceremony. Adrian's sister, Patricia, who came from Florida with her husband and immediately adopted me with the warm, practical efficiency of a woman who had been hoping her brother would do this for years. Daniel and Christine and the children. Two of my oldest friends who had driven 5 hours because they said they would have driven 15. Adrian's closest friend from the firm, a man named George, who cried openly during the whole thing and was entirely unembarrassed about it. No audience, no performance, no flowers, except the ones Adrian had picked up that morning from a farmer's market 2 towns over, informal and slightly imperfect, which I preferred to anything formal. Emma was my flower girl, which she took extremely seriously. Tyler carried the rings, which he did with the focused gravity of a 7-year-old who understands that this is the important job. Daniel walked me in, which we had discussed briefly and without drama, and which he did with a steadiness that told me something about how much the past 8 months had changed him, or rather, how much they'd returned him to himself, his real self underneath the carefully curated life. The sun I'd raised. I don't remember everything that was said. I remember the light, April light, early afternoon, the particular golden quality of a day that has decided to be beautiful without making a fuss about it. I remember Adrian's face when I came in, the way it moved through something and settled into something else, something quieter and more certain than I'd ever seen on it. I remember Emma's intense concentration on the petals. I remember Daniel squeezing my hand once, quickly before he stepped back. I remember saying yes again, the same word I'd said at the kitchen table over overcooked chicken in February, because some words don't lose their weight from repetition. Sometimes they gain it. When it was over, we stood in the April afternoon and George was crying again, and Patricia was laughing at George crying, and Emma was trying to explain to Tyler the precise, correct way to scatter petals, a conversation Tyler was tolerating with the resigned patience of a younger sibling, and Christine was standing next to Daniel with her hand in his, and there was something real in her face, something that wasn't composed or managed, just present, just human. She caught me looking. She didn't look away. "Congratulations, Evelyn," she said. "Thank you," I said, "for coming. I wouldn't have missed it," she said, and then quietly, "I'm glad you're okay. I'm glad all of this happened. I know that sounds strange." "It doesn't," I said. "I think I am too. It did not fix everything between us. I want to be honest about that because this is an honest story, and I'm not interested in the version where everything resolves cleanly at the ending." Christine and I were not suddenly best friends. We were two women who had a complicated history and who were choosing, slowly and imperfectly, to try. That's the real version. That's what actual reconciliation looks like. Not a single moment of absolution, but the accumulation of small choices to do better, to be more honest, to not let the worst version of yourself be the definitive one. Adrian found me a little while later, standing at the edge of the yard, looking at the garden that would be. I'd put the hydrangeas in the previous week, 3 of them along the back fence, not yet blooming, just planted, just beginning. He came and stood beside me, this man who was now my husband, which was a word I turned over in my mind with something like wonder. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Actually, yes, not the version I tell people, the real one." He smiled. He remembered saying that to me. "What are you thinking about?" I looked at the hydrangeas. "The fire," I said. He waited. "I've been afraid to say this," I said, "because it sounds like I'm grateful for something terrible. But I think the fire saved me. Not the house burning, not the loss, but what came after, being forced out of the life I'd organized around being comfortable and accommodating and small." I paused. I was disappearing, Adrian, slowly and very politely, and I didn't know it until there was nothing left to hide behind. He was quiet for a moment. "You weren't disappearing," he said. "You were waiting." "For what?" "For the thing that would make you stop waiting," he said simply. I looked at him. My husband, 68 years old, white-haired, with his architect's eyes and his patient heart and his ongoing grudge against overcooked chicken. Not the life I'd planned. Nothing like the life I'd planned. Better. In all the ways that matter, so much better. The fire had taken 41 years of accumulated things. The journals and the flannel shirt and my mother's ceramic pot and 41 years of pencil marks on a kitchen door frame. It had taken things I would grieve for the rest of my life, quietly and without drama, in the way that real grief settles into a person not as a wound, but as a permanent tenderness in a specific place. But it had also taken the last of the infrastructure I'd used to stay small, the last of the comfortable containment, the last of the version of me that fit inside other people's margins and called it living. What was left in the ash had been the actual thing, and the actual thing, it turned out, had been enough all along. More than enough. Had been. Waiting under the careful, accommodating surface. A woman who could stand in a burned yard at 65 years old with nothing but a suitcase and a cracked phone and a name in a notebook, and choose to pick up the phone anyway. That woman had been there the whole time. The fire just cleared the way for her to step forward. I stood in my April garden with my husband beside me and the hydrangeas planted along the back fence and the whole green possible summer still ahead, and I thought, I am 65 years old and I have buried a husband and raised a son and lost a house and found my way to the other side of all of it. And what I know now that I did not know before is this: it is never too late to choose the life that was always meant to be yours. You just have to be willing to walk through the fire to find it. The hydrangeas bloomed in June. I want to tell you that because it matters in a way I couldn't have articulated when I planted them. I put those 3 plants in the ground in late April with the practical skepticism of a woman who has killed enough things in enough gardens to know that wanting something to live and making it live are 2 entirely different propositions. I watered them. I amended the soil the way Adrian's research. And yes, he researched hydrangea soil. I am married to a man who researches soil. Said to amend it. I checked on them with the particular attentiveness of someone who has lost too many things to be casual about the things that remain. And in June, all 3 of them bloomed. Big, full, ridiculous heads of blue, the same blue as the ones I'd had at the old house, which I understand is partly about soil chemistry and partly about what variety I'd chosen, but which felt, standing in my backyard on a June morning with my coffee, like something more personal than that, like a continuation, like the garden saying, you thought this was over. It wasn't over. I stood there looking at them for a long time, long enough that Adrian came out to see what I was doing, carrying his own coffee, still in the slightly battered state that constitutes his pre-9 o'clock presentation to the world, which I have come to find genuinely endearing. They're blue, he said. They're blue, I agreed. I told you the soil amendment would work. You did tell me that, I said. You told me several times. The second time was because you looked skeptical. I was skeptical. And now? I looked at the hydrangeas. I thought about the ones at the old house along the fence I'd planted them against 15 years ago. The ones that were ash now. The ones I thought of the night the fire took everything. I thought about standing in Miss Patterson's backyard watching the roof collapse. I thought about room 14 of the Sycamore Inn and the phone number in the back of a notebook and the decision to dial it. And now they're blue, I said. He put his arm around me, easy and unhurried the way he does things. And we stood in the June morning and looked at the garden we'd built together, which was imperfect. The tomatoes were already showing signs of their annual resistance to my best efforts, and real and ours. I'm going to tell you what happened with Daniel, because this story isn't finished until I do. And I am going to tell you all of it, not the comfortable version, because you've been with me through the fire and the motel and the kitchen conversation I wasn't supposed to hear, and you've earned the complicated version. Daniel came to us in July, not for a scheduled visit, not for a holiday. He called on a Sunday afternoon and said he needed to talk, and his voice had that specific tightness in it that I had learned over the past months to take seriously. I told him to come for dinner. He came alone without Christine, which itself was information. He sat at my kitchen table, the table Adrian and I had picked out together in March, solid oak, with the particular heft of furniture meant to last, and he looked older than his 38 years, not badly older, just like a man who'd been doing some hard interior work, and the work had left marks the way real work always does. Christine and I are good, he said before I could ask. I want to say that first. We're better than we've been in years. The therapy helped a lot, more than I expected. I'm glad, I said, and I meant it without complication. It's something else. He turned his coffee cup. The therapist asked me, a few months ago, she asked me to think about the pattern. Not just what happened with you and the house. The whole pattern. Going back, he looked up, and I realized something I don't think I've ever said out loud. I waited. I've been managing you my whole life, he said. Managing the relationship. Keeping you at a comfortable distance that felt like closeness. Calling often enough that I felt like a good son without actually... He stopped. Without actually letting you in. Without letting things be messy or complicated or real. He exhaled. Christine learned it from me. That's the thing I had to sit with. She didn't invent it. I taught her that you were someone to be managed by doing it myself, for years before she ever met you. The kitchen was very quiet. I have thought about how to respond to that moment many times since. What the right thing to say was. Whether there's a right thing to say when your adult child sits at your table and hands you the truth about the shape of your relationship, the real shape of it, the one that was underneath all the Sunday calls and the birthday dinners and the Christmas visits that felt complete from the outside and somehow hollow in the center. What I said was, I know. He looked at me. I think I've known for a long time, I said. I told myself it was just how adult children are. That distance was normal, that asking for more was asking for too much. I paused. I was so afraid of being too much that I accepted too little, for years. I'm sorry, Mom. His voice was raw. Not the managed apology of the phone calls, not the careful version, the unprocessed one. I kept you at arm's length and called it respect for your independence, and it wasn't. It was easier. You're a lot of person. And instead of rising to that, I just kept the door mostly closed and told myself you preferred it that way. I didn't, I said quietly. I know. He looked at his hands. I know that now. Here's what I want to tell you because I think it's the most important thing in this whole story. More important than the fire, and more important than Adrian, and more important than any of the dramatic moments that make for a compelling sequence of events. This conversation, this specific Sunday evening in July at my kitchen table with the hydrangeas visible through the back window, was harder than watching my house burn. It was harder than hearing Christine call me a problem from the kitchen hallway. It was harder than sitting in room 14 with $40 and nowhere to go. Because it required something the crisis moments don't require. Crisis is clarifying. Crisis strips everything to the essential and forces decisions and actions that in ordinary circumstances might take years. But this was the ordinary moment, the quiet Sunday, the coffee cup, the son sitting across from me with the truth in his hands, offering it without the urgency of emergency to make the offering easier. This required me to receive something painful from someone I loved without either minimizing it or weaponizing it, to hold the hurt of it and the love of it at the same time, in the same hands, without dropping either. I have spent 65 years believing that love is supposed to be uncomplicated when it's real. I know now that's not true. I know now that real love is exactly as complicated as the people it connects, and the complication isn't the failure of it. The complication is the texture of it, the proof that it's alive. What do you want? I asked Daniel. Not what you're sorry for. What do you want? Going forward. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to know you. Actually know you. Not the version I kept at comfortable distance. You. He looked at me steadily. I want Emma and Tyler to know you the way I should have let them know you years ago. I want to call you when nothing is wrong, just because I want to talk. I want to come over here and eat dinner and let it be inconvenient sometimes, and not organize it into something manageable. He paused. I want to be your son, for real, not the managed version. I looked at my son across the table. He was not perfect. I want to say that clearly because I think one of the great lies we tell about reconciliation is that it requires the other person to have arrived at perfection before we can let them back in. Daniel was not perfect. He had kept me at careful distance for years. He had stayed silent in a kitchen when he should have spoken. He had let his wife say the word problem about his own mother and not pushed back until the damage was already done. And he was also a man who was sitting at my table on a Sunday in July, choosing the hard conversation over the comfortable one, who had gone to therapy and done the work and arrived here with the real truth instead of the polished version, who loved his children well, which I had seen with my own eyes, which told me something about what he was capable of when he let himself be present. We are not just the worst things we've done. I know this because I'm not just the woman who sent a cowardly letter in 1983 and spent 40 years being carefully small. I'm also the woman who called the number at 2 in the morning, who stood in the burned yard and chose to survive it, who planted hydrangeas and meant it. Okay, I said. He looked up. Let's try that, I said. The real version. Let's try. He didn't cry. Neither did I. We're not those kinds of people, the Carters. We carry things quietly and show them sideways, in gestures rather than declarations. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his briefly, the way his father used to, and I held it for a moment before we both let go, and he said, "Is Adrian home?" And I said, "He's in the yard doing something architectural to the patio furniture." And Daniel said, "I'll go help," and went outside, and I sat at the kitchen table and let the evening settle around me. Through the window, I could see them. Adrian and my son, two men of very different ages and very different histories, both of whom I love for entirely different reasons, standing on the patio looking at the furniture in question. Adrian was explaining something. Daniel was listening, which is not always a given with Daniel, but he was listening. At one point, Daniel laughed at something Adrian said, a real laugh, the one I knew from when he was small, and something in my chest that had been held at low tension for months, finally fully released, not fixed. I want to keep saying that because it's true and it matters, not the end of complication, not the arrival at the place where everything is resolved and the music swells and the credits roll. Just real, finally, fully, imperfectly real. Adrian proposed in February. I already told you that. What I didn't tell you is what happened the morning after when it was just the two of us at the kitchen table at ordinary February light, with the ring on my finger and the overnight's evidence of a life around us. His coffee, my tea, the pothos Christine had given me growing in the window, the stack of books Adrian kept migrating from his house to mine and back again in a pattern that had started to seem less like forgetfulness and more like a slow organic merging of libraries. "I need to tell you something," I said. He looked up from the paper he'd been reading, one of those actual physical newspapers he subscribed to, which I found both anachronistic and characteristic. "You're regretting the yes," he said, flatly, testing. "No," I said, "obviously not." "Then tell me." I turned my teacup. "I've been thinking about what I said at the bungalow when we were looking at it, about not knowing what I was doing, about being scared of needing someone." I paused. "I want you to know that I know the difference now, between needing you because I'm afraid of being alone and choosing you because you're the person I want to be with. Those are different things and they lead to different marriages, and I've been in one of them before and I know what the other one looks like." He set the newspaper down. "This is the second kind," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not here because I'm afraid. I'm here because you are specifically and irreplaceably you, and I have spent 41 years being alive at the same time as you without being in the same room, and I don't want to spend any more time like that. That's not need. That's choice." He looked at me for a long moment. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes, that is the most direct you have ever been with me." "I'm practicing," I said, "being direct. I've been indirect for 65 years, and it turns out it's exhausting and largely counterproductive." "It is," he agreed. "I'm going to be like this more often." "I hope so," he said. "I have found it extremely effective." Don't push it, I said. He smiled. That full one, the rare one, the one that reaches all the way. I know the difference too, he said. In case you're wondering, I've been alone long enough to know the difference between loneliness driving something and wanting driving it. This is the second one, has been since you opened that motel room door. I looked terrible that morning, I said. You look like yourself, he said. That was the point. We got married in April. I told you about the wedding already. The light and Emma's serious flower girl face, and George crying, and Christine's real expression, and Daniel squeezing my hand. What I didn't tell you about is what happened 3 days after, when the sister-in-law I didn't have until April called me on the phone. Patricia, Adrian's sister, from Florida, warm and direct in the way of people who decided long ago that life is too short for the other kind. She'd adopted me at the wedding with the breezy, uncomplicated affection of someone who had been waiting for her brother to do something sensible and was delighted the wait was over. I have to tell you something, she said, and Adrian will probably be annoyed that I'm telling you, but I think you should know. All right, I said. After Ellen died, after the first year, I used to call him every Sunday just to check. He was fine, you know, he was functional, but he was the kind of fine that worries you more than not fine, because at least not fine is honest. She paused. One Sunday, about 2 years after Ellen, he said something I never forgot. He said, I think I left someone behind a long time ago, and I don't know if that's why this feels the way it feels or if it's just grief, but I think about her. I was very still. He didn't say your name, Patricia said. He never said the name. But I knew because he'd mentioned you exactly once, years before, in that way people mention things they're trying not to make a big deal of and completely fail. A pause. I just thought you should know that he didn't come for you out of nowhere. He came for you because some part of him had never quite let go. And you should know that because you deserve to know the full story. I sat with that for a long time after the call. The full story. What a strange and large thing to be handed. I thought about Adrian in his car outside the Sycamore Inn, sitting those 45 seconds before he got out, taking a breath, composing himself before walking into a moment that couldn't be undone. I thought at the time it was the caution of a man who wasn't sure what he was walking into. I understood now it was the composure of a man who knew exactly what he was walking into and had been in some form walking toward it for a very long time. I called him. He picked up on the second ring. Your sister called me, I said. A pause. She told me she was going to. You knew? She told me after she hung up with you, he said. She said, I told your wife the thing. I told him which thing. She said the thing, and I knew which thing. Adrian. Yes? Why didn't you tell me yourself? A long pause. Because some things feel like they should come from someone else, he said. Because if I told you, it might sound like a claim, like I was trying to establish something. And Patricia telling you is just information without agenda. I thought about that. You could have just told me, I said. I know, he said. I'm occasionally still indirect. I'm going to be patient about that, I said, but just for the first year. That's fair, he said. Actually, that's very fair. We moved fully into the bungalow in May, which involved the formal migration of Adrian's books, the houseplant that had lived on his kitchen windowsill, and a truly alarming number of architectural references that now occupied an entire wall of the second room we'd converted into something between an office and a library. He kept his own house. We weren't ready to close that door entirely, and practical wisdom suggested maintaining options. But he was at mine more nights than not, and the distinction between his space and mine was softening into something that felt less like two separate territories and more like a life with two addresses and one actual center. The center was the kitchen table. I know that sounds mundane, but I have learned this year of all years that the mundane things are where everything real lives. Not in the dramatic moments, articles, not in the fire or the motel room or the burned lot or the December closing. Those are the hinge points, the places where the story turns. But the story itself lives at the kitchen table, in the ordinary evenings, in the overcooked chicken, and the tea versus coffee debate and the newspapers and the slightly aggressive opinions about tile from 1994. The story lives in the Tuesday afternoon when Emma called to tell me she'd gotten the best grade in her class on the Bridges project, and I could hear in her voice the particular pride of a child who has been genuinely seen and encouraged. And I knew that Adrian had been on the phone with her twice, helping her prepare, which he had mentioned only once and in passing, as if it were nothing, as if sitting on the phone with an 8-year-old explaining cantilever mechanics was simply what people did. The story lives in the September Sunday when Daniel came for dinner without Christine and the kids, just him, just my son. And we sat on the back patio for 3 hours after the food was gone and talked, really talked, the way we hadn't in I couldn't tell you how many years. He told me things about his marriage, the hard years before the therapy, the fears he'd carried that he'd never said out loud to me because he hadn't trusted that I could hold them without either collapsing or managing. I told him things about Martine, the difficult years, the silences that could go a week, the way I'd learned to read his moods like weather and plan around them. We sat in the September evening and we handed each other the real things for the first time. He left at 10 o'clock, and at the door he hugged me the way he'd hugged me the night I'd left his house. The kind that means something, the kind that lasts past the physical contact. I like who you are, he said, into my shoulder. I don't think I ever told you that. Not just I love you, I like who you are. I held on to him. I like who you're becoming, I said back. That's even better. He pulled back and looked at me, and he had Martin's jaw and my eyes, and something that was entirely his own, some quality of finally being present in his own face that I hadn't seen there before. He's going to be all right, my son. Not perfect, but all right and getting better at it, and that's the most I could have asked for. October came, and with it the anniversary of the fire. I didn't mark it on the calendar. I didn't plan anything around it. But I knew when it was, the way you know the anniversaries of large things, without quite meaning to track them, and I woke up on that specific October morning and lay in bed for a while in the early grey light and let myself go back to it. 2 in the morning, the smell of smoke, the digital clock, the backyard in the dark, my own feet on the still warm ground, the orange sky. I went back to it and I held it, not with grief exactly, with something more like respect. That night had been the end of something, yes, of a house and a history and a version of my life I'd organized around staying comfortable and careful and acceptably small. But it had also been the beginning of something, and you can't honor the beginning without honoring the fire that preceded it. I got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the October morning and wrote in my notebook. Not the organized kind of writing, the loose first thing in the morning kind, where the pen moves faster than the editor in your brain, and what comes out is closer to truth than what you'd produce if you were trying. I wrote about the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame, about the fact that the last marks I'd made were Daniel, 15. He'd told me he was too old, and I'd said just one more year, one more, and he'd relented with teenage exasperation, and I'd measured him and written the date and thought, next year I'll talk him into it again. I never did. He'd held the line and I'd let it go the way you let things go when you're trying not to be too much. I wrote about the hydrangeas along the back fence of the new house, about how I'd been afraid they wouldn't take, and they had. I wrote about the law school application I'd never submitted, and then I stopped, and then I wrote, it is still not too late for the thing under the law school. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with that, but I wrote it down, which is the first step, which is how I've always treated the things that matter. Adrian came downstairs while I was writing. He didn't ask what I was doing. He made his coffee, looked at the backyard through the window, and then came and sat across from me. He'd learned over these months when to ask and when to just be present. This was a when to be present morning, and he knew it. A year ago today, I said finally. I know, he said. I was thinking about the motel room. Room 14, he said. I looked at him. You remember the number? I remember everything about that morning, he said. The parking lot, the tabby cat, the cat. I'd forgotten about the cat. It was very unimpressed with my situation. Cats are very unimpressed with situations, generally, he said. It's one of their better qualities. I looked at him across the kitchen table, this man who remembered the parking lot cat, who remembered every detail of a morning that had changed the rest of my life, because it had changed his too, in a different way. Because he had driven 40 minutes and stepped out of his car into a parking lot outside a run-down motel and walked toward a woman he hadn't spoken to in 41 years, and every one of those years had led to that morning, and he had not been sorry for a moment of it. Thank you, I said, not for the first time, but with the full weight of the year behind it. For what specifically, he said. I want to give the right response. For coming, I said, that morning, for just coming, without conditions or calculations, for getting in the car. He looked at me for a long moment. That was the easiest decision I've ever made, he said. The easiest. Everything after it has been more complicated. Are you complaining? Absolutely not, he said. I'm contextualizing. I smiled at him. My husband, with his white hair and his architectural opinions and the newspaper he still physically subscribed to, and the way he looked at me like I was the actual thing and not the managed version of it. Not perfect. God, not perfect. He was stubborn about windows in a way that could be genuinely unreasonable, and he had a tendency to go quiet when he was worried instead of saying he was worried, which I had identified as a pattern and was periodically tactfully addressing. And I knew he found me occasionally too intense, too direct. Now that I'd stopped being indirect, occasionally too willing to say the uncomfortable thing out loud. We were two imperfect people who had taken the long way around and found each other in the rubble of a life that needed to be rebuilt. That's not a fairy tale. That's something better than a fairy tale, because it's real, and real things have weight that stories don't. Christine called that afternoon. Just to check in, she said, which was new. 6 months ago, she would not have called just to check in, and the fact that she did now was something I registered without making it into more than it was. We talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things. Emma's next school project, Tyler's new obsession with a video game she found incomprehensible, a dinner she was thinking of making that she wanted my recipe opinion on, which was, I want to note, a genuine first. Before she hung up, she said, I know what day it is today, the anniversary. I wanted you to know that I think about it, what we did, what I did. A pause. I don't want to make this into a big thing. I just wanted to say it. Thank you, I said. That matters. Okay, she said. Good. Her voice had the slightly awkward quality of someone who has done an emotionally vulnerable thing and is now unsure how to exit the conversation with dignity. Christine, I said. Yeah? The dinner, the recipe. Send me what you're thinking and I'll tell you what you're missing. I'll text you tonight, she said, and I could hear in it the very slight relaxation of relief, the gratitude for the ordinary offered after the hard thing. This is what reconciliation actually looks like, not grand gestures, the recipe text, the check-in call, the small daily choosing to try. We're not going to be best friends, Christine and I. I'm clear-eyed enough to know that, and she probably is too, but we are going to be something real, something that makes Daniel's life easier and Emma and Tyler's world larger, something that is built on the honest acknowledgement of what happened and the genuine effort to be better than it. That's enough. Actually enough. Not the settling kind of enough, but the real kind. In November, I enrolled in a paralegal certification program at the county college. I know that's not law school. I know I'm 66 years old and I'm not going to become an attorney, and the version of me at 24 who hadn't submitted that application is beyond the reach of retroactive correction. But the thing under the law school, the wanting to be taken seriously, the wanting my intelligence to count for something in a room, that thing is not beyond reach. The program is 18 months. I go on Tuesday and Thursday evening. I am, by a significant margin, the oldest student in the class, which I have found bothers me less than I expected and energizes me more than I anticipated. My professor is 20 years younger than me and is quietly thrilled to have a student who does the reading not because it's assigned, but because she finds it genuinely interesting. My classmates are mostly people in their 20s and 30s who are changing careers or starting them, and they are mostly good company. I do not mother them. I do not try to be peer-like with them either. I am 66 years old and I have lived a complete life, and I sit in that classroom as what I am, take nothing, pretend nothing, and find, to my genuine surprise, that this is not a liability. A girl named Rashida, 26 and very sharp, asked me after the third class why I was doing this now. At my age, she said, and then immediately apologized for how that sounded. Don't apologize, I said. It's a fair question. So why, she said. Because I should have done it 40 years ago, I said, and I didn't, and this is the closest available version of the correct decision. I paused. And because I've spent 60 years being carefully reasonable, and it turns out that being carefully reasonable costs something. It costs you the life you were actually capable of. She looked at me for a moment. That's the most useful thing anyone said to me in this class, she said. I told Adrian about it that evening at dinner. He was quiet for a moment, in the thoughtful way, rather than the gone quiet because he's worried way, and then he said, "You should have been a lawyer." "Probably," I said. "You still argue like one." "I argue like someone who spent 40 years being reasonable and is making up for lost time," I said. "Same thing in your case," he said. He was not wrong. The tomatoes, for what it's worth, did not come out right that first summer. They were small and inconsistent and arrived in such an unpredictable pattern that you couldn't plan a meal around them, and the ones that came out best were the ones I'd essentially ignored for 2 weeks because I was busy and then discovered had quietly done their own thing without my intervention. I found this philosophically instructive. I planted them again the following spring with the same lack of realistic expectation and the same stubbornness that I had maintained my whole life about things I wanted and couldn't quite make work. Adrian observed this annual ritual with the fond patience of a man who has made his peace with other people's irrational optimism. "They're going to do the same thing," he said. "Probably," I said. "You know that." "Yes," I said. "I'm planting them anyway." He handed me the trowel. "That's the correct attitude toward tomatoes," he said for the second time, and I laughed, because some jokes become good from repetition rather than despite it, and some lives become rich from exactly the same mechanism. Here is what I know now that I didn't know 14 months ago, standing in my backyard in a nightgown watching my house burn. I know that the cruelest thing a life can do is make you comfortable in a space too small for you. Not dramatically uncomfortable, that would at least be clarifying. No, the cruelest thing is the slow, gentle, almost imperceptible narrowing of your own sense of what you're allowed to want, what you're allowed to take up, what you're allowed to be. It happens over years, over accommodations, over the choosing of the reasonable thing instead of the real thing again and again and again, until the reasonable thing feels like the only available thing and you forget there were ever others. I know that the people who love you correctly are not the ones who need the least from you. That's management, dressed up in the language of love. The people who love you correctly are the ones who see the full, complicated, difficult version of you and don't ask you to make it smaller. They might ask you to direct it differently sometimes. They might need room to breathe beside it, but they don't ask you to make it smaller. I know that it is possible to receive something painful from someone you love, a truth you didn't ask for, an admission of how they failed you, and hold it without either minimizing it or using it as a permanent weapon. This is one of the hardest skills I have learned. I am still learning it. I will probably be learning it for the rest of however long I have, because it requires a kind of emotional dexterity that doesn't fully arrive. It just gets more available with practice. I know that family is not destiny. A son who kept you at careful distance can choose to come closer. A daughter-in-law who called you a problem can learn slowly and imperfectly to do better. A woman who spent her whole life being manageable can stop at 65 in the rubble of everything she thought was solid and choose to take up her full and actual space. None of these things are guaranteed. None of them happened automatically or without effort or without the full complicated mess of two people trying to be better than they've been and not always succeeding. But they happened. They are happening right now in a house with a repaired kitchen and a garden and a wall full of architectural references and a blue-chipped mug that belongs to me. They are happening. And I want to tell you, whoever you are, wherever you're watching from, whatever city you're in right now, I want to tell you this. You are allowed to want more than what you've been given. You are allowed to reach for it, even at an age you think is past the reaching. You are allowed to plant the hydrangeas again, even if the first one's burned. You are allowed to dial the number in the back of the notebook, even when your hand is shaking. You're allowed to walk out of the room where someone called you a problem and into a life where someone drives 40 minutes in the early morning to tell you, by the simple act of showing up, that you are not one. The fire that takes everything from you is not always the worst thing that happens to you. Sometimes it is the thing that finally, after all the careful years, all the managed years, all the years of being deliberately and exhaustingly reasonable, sometimes it is the thing that clears the ground. And on cleared ground, if you're brave enough to plant something, if you're stubborn enough to keep watering it even when you're not sure it's going to take, things grow, blue things mostly, the kind that bloom in June when the winter is finally fully over.